Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. As Director of Lectures and Seminars, it's always my privilege to remind everyone that you should turn off your cell phones as we prepare to begin. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our Heritage homepage and on C-SPAN. Our Internet and C-SPAN viewers are always encouraged to participate in our question and answers. Simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org, and we will be glad to add them to the discussion. That's speaker@heritage.org. We will, of course, post the program within 24 hours on our Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference as well. Opening our program this afternoon will be Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center. He also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where he leads a graduate seminar on American foreign policy interests in Southeast Asia. Prior to joining us here at Heritage, he was Senior Vice President and Executive Director of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, as well as serving as a Senior Country Director at the Council. He's also served on the Republican staff for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and senatorial aide on Capitol Hill. Please join me in welcoming Walter Lohman. Walter?
Thanks, John. Well, it's good to be here today among so many good friends, Korean, Japanese, and many others. We're here to talk about a pretty serious issue as interests in Southeast Asia go, and that's a matter of history. Of course, when we say history, what we're talking about really is Japanese occupation of Korea, World War II, and the lead up to World War II. It's funny, you never talk about, you never reference sort of post-World War II history when you're talking about history, the many decades now of Japanese contributions to international relations and economy, but nevertheless, we know what we're talking about when we say history. Even listing the events can be a matter of controversy. So for now, we'll just let the word history speak for itself, and we'll let our guests help unpack the word a little bit for us. Call it American optimism if you'd like, but I hope that we could actually get to some conversation here about how we isolate the disputes that Japan and Korea have over matters of the past, and talk about some ways that we can manage those issues going forward so we can focus on some of the real priorities in the Japan-Korea relationship, as well as a trilateral relationship with the United States. To lead off the discussion today, we're very pleased and indeed honored to welcome Admiral Blair to our stage, Heritage Foundation. As you know, Admiral Blair is former commander, U.S. Pacific Command, and he's former director of the National Intelligence, former director of National Intelligence. He's also chairman of the board of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA. SPF in Tokyo was very kind to host our new president, DeMint, in Tokyo just a couple months ago. He gave a big speech there at Sasakawa. We've got copies of it out front if you'd like to take a look at it. And for those of you watching online, you can go to our website and find a copy of that speech. Admiral Blair also hosted us and President DeMint at Sasakawa, Washington, Sasakawa, USA, for a debrief on that trip. We're very, very pleased to be in a position to return the favor and invite Admiral Blair to Heritage Foundation stage to share some of his thoughts with us today. Thank you. Admiral Blair.
Well, thanks very much, Walter. It is a pleasure to be here to talk about what is a very serious subject. The Spanish philosopher George Santayana once famously remarked that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. This ringing phrase has generally been taken out of context and used to justify false historical analogies for current actions. To me, a more trenchant quote has been attributed to the French master diplomat Talleyrand, who is supposed to have said, speaking of the Bourbon dynasty, "They have learned nothing, they have forgotten nothing." And I see elements really both of Santayana's and of Talleyrand's observations in the use and the misuse of history by governments in Northeast Asia. It often seems to me that these three powerful countries in that region, China, Republic of Korea, Japan, all with long entangled histories, are really rowing down the stream of history, facing backwards on their boats of state. They're rowing hard, lots of energy, blades are flailing the water, foam is flying everywhere. They're moving somewhat faster than the currents would carry them. However, like most rowers, they mostly see their own wake. They mostly see the water and the shoreline that's really behind them. They see what is ahead of them only when they turn their head and take a quick look over their shoulders. They do not seem to me to have a fixed destination in mind towards which they are steadily rowing. They don't really seem to me to have a sense of how swiftly these larger currents are carrying them down the river. Consider China. Chinese leaders are driven by what they see as 125 years of history of humiliation, and they're determined never to suffer a period like that again. Yet as they are steering by the wake of their powerful past humiliations, they're less aware of the huge currents that are propelling them down the river. And the greatest of these are the currents of international economic relations and globalization. Yes, it's true that European countries and the United States carved concessions out of China in the late 19th century. But it's also true that it is the trade, commercial, financial, and other interactions with these same countries a century later that has propelled China to become the second largest, second most powerful economy in the world. Or consider Japan. Japan is making its new defense policy not so much by defining its interests, looking towards the future, but by revising a single constitutional interpretation of the past. That interpretation of its ability to exercise the right of collective self-defense. The currents in this big river, the nature of the riverbanks have changed fundamentally since that time. Japanese militarism of the 1930s developed in an era of rising fascism in many countries, a worldwide depression that bred desperation and receptivity to extremist political views in many countries around the world. The world of the future is not one of rival ideologically motivated power blocks contesting for world dominance. It's rather a world of contesting individual nations, sometimes acting individually, sometimes cooperating and functional multilateral groups of various kinds. It's a world in which failing states pose as much danger as do powerful states, in which extremist violent groups and weak states can pose dangers to developed states in an interconnected world. It's a world in which a major country like Japan needs to employ its diplomatic, its economic, its military power in sophisticated, interlocking ways to cooperate with like-minded allies to preserve security and prosperity for themselves, for the region, and for the world. And Japan requires major changes to its security policies, not just small adjustments to legacy concepts from a past age. And finally, consider Korea. Korean leaders' attitudes are driven in part by historical fears that both Japan and China somehow look down on Korea based on historical experience. They fear economic domination by China, similar to its military domination of Korea in the past. They reject Japanese apologies for its actions during the colonial period because they do not consider them to be sincere. Koreans suspect that the Japanese do not respect them. They celebrate two separate national holidays on Japanese colonial rule: the Independence Movement Day, commemorating the independence effort of March 1st, 1919, and National Liberation Day on August 15th. And just this year, jointly with the Chinese, they completed a new memorial for Ahn Jung-geun, honored as a patriot in Seoul, but condemned as a terrorist in Tokyo for assassinating Japan's then resident general of Korea and former Prime Minister of Japan, Hirobumi Ito, in 1909. Yet the big currents of world development have propelled Korea to a much more secure position than it held in the past. It has a security treaty with the United States, the most powerful nation in the world. Territorial conquest has been discredited as a means of building power. Economic prowess counts for more based on hard work, entrepreneurial dynamism, adaptability. Other forms of soft power, such as cultural influences, are also increasingly important. And by these measures, Korea is a very powerful country. It can deal as a peer with all nations of the world, including China and Japan. And it should take counsel of its ambitions, not of its fears. So history is important, and historical ignorance can cause a country to repeat the same mistake twice. However, remembering too much history Understanding too little of the difference between the past and the present can conjure up false historical analogies, can restrict a country's ability to make progress, can cause it to miss opportunities for positive change. There's another characteristic of the effect of history on a country's international policies that we should note. Psychologists tells us that for most people, individuals, the memory of pleasure is more important and lasting than is the memory of pain. For nations, memory seems to be equally selective, but to operate in the opposite direction. For countries, it seems memories of past failures, past injustices, past insults are the most powerful memories they have and compel actions. China, for example, still thinks of itself in part as a developing, wronged, and weak country. But China is the second largest economy in the world, with nuclear and armed forces to match. The rest of the world thinks of China as a highly developed, very powerful country. Japan's attitude towards international relations is somewhat dominated by memories of just 15 years, 1930 roughly to 1945, in which a military faction gained control of the government, ran the country into disaster. The 70 years of restraint and exemplary behavior since that time don't seem as important in Japan's self-image. The Republic of Korea, in many ways, thinks of itself as a small divided country, a shrimp among whales, many times invaded, rather than as one of the largest economies in the world, with a GDP per capita increasing over the past half-century more than any of its neighbors, a worldwide reputation for manufacturing excellence, an active presence in international peacekeeping operations, and a major contributor of overseas development assistance, and a vibrant culture that has international appeal. And then finally, there's the politics of history, which also play a role here. Governments exploit history for partisan, political, and power purposes, and episodes of history that are the most useful for these purposes are often the ones that were the most humiliating. Dictatorships like China exploit historical wrongs to build nationalistic resentment that strengthens their grip on power. Democracies like Japan and Korea also exploit historical injuries and insults to bid for political power, to appeal to groups with whom these issues have special resonance. It's easy to fall into this syndrome. No politician in a dictatorship or a democracy wants to be vulnerable to accusations of inadequate patriotism, softness in supporting the country's honor. And most leaders believe they can control nationalism. They can incite it enough to serve their political purposes, but not so much that it causes damage to their countries. However, there's a thin line in any country between healthy patriotism and xenophobic nationalism. The introduction of controversial historical events into current policies and politics often blurs that line and sometimes crosses it. And even if nationalism does not become extreme, it certainly prevents progress in other areas that are important to countries in their international relations and in their national development. Whatever its root causes and explanations, this exploitation of painful episodes of a nation's past at the expense of current relations with a neighboring country is a conscious political decision, whether it be to visit a controversial wartime shrine, raising the issue of those who are euphemistically called comfort women, or emphasis on an especially brutal episode in a long and savage war. There have been extended periods in recent relations between Korea and Japan on the one hand, between Japan and China on the other hand, when historical issues did not play such a large and crippling role. Leaders in all three countries understood that the benefits of cooperation in many areas, business, cultural, people to people, were more important to their country's development. While not denying or covering up the historical issues, and in fact, in many cases, taking steps to acknowledge them and to try to apologize for them, they did not highlight them. They did not allow them to so dominate the relationship that it prevented progress in other areas, as is the case now. Moreover, historical animosities clearly can be ameliorated, as has been the European experience with Germany and most of the rest of Asia's experience with Japan, including Taiwan, which, like Korea, was colonized by Japan, and like both in Seoul and Beijing, has an unresolved territorial issue with Tokyo. So much for admiring the problem of historical issues and nationalism in international relations. The much more difficult question is what to do about it. And we have two panels that follows our talks that hopefully can come up with some ideas about it. Let me give you mine. As I mentioned earlier, the solution ultimately lies with political leadership in all three countries. Political leaders must decide that the disadvantages of emphasizing historical issues with their neighbors outweigh the advantages. And as I mentioned, this has been the case in the past when relations between Japan and China and between Japan and Korea were relatively cordial and cooperative. However, there are other actions that can be taken by others in all three countries and by their friends in the United States. As a first step, China, Japan, and Korea must understand their own histories in a more mature way. All countries have painful episodes in their past. The United States has at least 3 major instances of unjust and brutal treatment of large groups of citizens, slavery and discrimination against African Americans, slaughter of Native Americans and expropriations of their land, internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. In most major historical episodes like these, some leaders and some ordinary citizens acted heroically. Some acted despicably. Until a country achieves a full understanding of its own history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, it cannot handle the internal pressures to simplify and exploit that history for political advantage, and it cannot handle the external pressures from other countries for repeated apologies or denial or leverage. However, there, in my mind, is a much more fundamental and important reason for the citizens of a country to understand their history. As human beings, we have to make sense of our lives. We need to know how we reached our current situations, what our forebears did, how that affects us. This applies to individuals, it applies to families, it applies to nations. There will always be elements of myth in both family and personal and national histories. But as we become more mature, we need to get below the myth and into the reality, the complex, messy mixture of heroism, cowardice, loyalty, betrayal, endurance, surrender that makes up real history, the way it actually happened. Now, it may be too much to hope that China can achieve historical honesty under its current form of government. Dictatorships are basically threatened by their own history, and that's why they work so hard to control it. Even when they try to deal with it, they come up with oversimplifications like Mao was 70% good and 30% wrong, or 70% wrong or 70% right and 30% wrong. They censor serious works of history, like Ezra Vogel's recent biography of Deng Xiaoping. However, I don't believe it is too much to hope that democracies like Japan and Korea can face their own histories more honestly than they do. Facing history is much more than just a sentence or two in a school textbook. It is the encouragement and the widespread discussion of serious works of history, such as Ari Huda's recent book, Japan 1941, an examination of why Japan decided to go to war with the obviously more powerful United States. It's an examination of Korean troops' conduct in the Vietnam War, where its soldiers had a reputation for brutality that surpassed that of the Americans and other countries. It's a discussion of serious works of history based on facts, not on whether a book hurts or helps some particular national reputation or political cause. Research and books are critical to coming to grips with history, but so too are movies, documentaries that reach a wider audience, often with more emotional power. The popular American director Clint Eastwood a few years ago made 2 movies about the Battle of Iwo Jima, one from the American point of view, one from the Japanese point of view. It's interesting that the movie from the Japanese point of view was more popular in the United States, received more Oscar nominations than did the one from the American point of view. Also, based on the American cases of shameful behavior that I mentioned, the business of coming to grips with the country's history never ends. It's not a case of putting a sentence in an official school textbook, tendering and accepting apologies, and then moving on. It's a case of continued research on the facts and opinions of the time. Books about African Americans written in the 1960s are very different from books written 50 years later. It's a case of refreshing public opinion as new facts and new insights come to light. In this sense, there really is no place for apology fatigue. Shameful episodes in national history will always be painful and embarrassing and will have to be faced and learned in greater depth. So getting the history right is one important step, but there are others. Opinion makers, public figures, media commentators should emphasize the important trends of the future as much as they talk about the narrow historical issues of the past. The great gains that countries in Asia have made since the end of the Second World War, since the end of the Civil War in China, since the end of the Korean War, have all been enabled by international cooperation. The economic miracles in Japan, Korea, and China have been based on foreign investment and exports. The political developments in Korea and Japan have occurred through personal, intellectual, and political contact with the rest of the world. Territorial aggression has been discredited among advanced nations as a way to increase power. In fact, major military aggression, whether by the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, by the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, is now generally considered to be hugely expensive for dubious gains. Things have changed since the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, the period in which most of the historical issues in Northeast Asia occurred. So while these opinion makers and influential spokesmen should not disregard or cover up historical issues, they should place them in this wider context of the changes that have taken place since those years. And most of all, handling historical issues puts a premium on national leadership in the countries concerned. It requires a very careful calibration of public statements along with private communications. Big public actions, even if they are accompanied by very careful statements, whether they are visits to Yasukuni Shrine or Dokdo Takshima Island, are simply fodder for exploitation by political opportunists. Public opinion needs to be shaped by smaller steps, thoughtful public statements on days of historical significance, encouragement of private initiatives to get history right, public admonitions of extremist statements, whether they are made by a political ally or a political enemy, wherever they are made. There's a particular role to be played by leaders who have established strong nationalist credentials. They can uniquely lead their countries to put historical animosities behind them without the risk of inciting a domestic backlash that might in turn only create a further spiral of acrimony. As Richard Nixon led an opening to China, as Deng Xiaoping led an opening to capitalism, so some current or future nationalist leader in Japan or Korea has an opportunity to leave his or her mark on history. And in addition, there is an important place for very private communications among national leaders. Trusted emissaries need to be used to test whether an overture, if offered, would be reciprocated. Because public statements and actions are so subject to mistaken interpretation, true intentions need to be conveyed through trusted channels. National leaders and their immediate staff need to resist the temptation to leak everything they do to the press so that they give the appearance of action and they give the appearance of being masters of the situation. So let me conclude by providing the rest of the story of George Santayana's most famous quote about history. After warning of the dangers of historical forgetfulness, he goes on to discuss what he calls a plane of manhood and true progress, in which new events and habits are grafted onto previous instincts. And this is truly the challenge for the leaders and for the citizens of the powerful countries of Northeast Asia. They need to understand their own histories, but they need to understand what has changed since the time that those historical events occurred. They need to avoid their history impeding their development of a better future. Rather than rowing their ships of state while facing the stern, they need to face forward, hoist the sails, grab the tiller, and steer confidently into the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Admiral. That was an extraordinarily thoughtful and constructive speech. I hope to look at it in some more detail a little bit into this program. As many of you know, Heritage has a long history of relationships in East Asia particularly, none closer than those we have in South Korea, which is why I'm very honored to introduce you to the Republic of Korea's ambassador to the United States, Ahn Ho-young. Ambassador Ahn was appointed just this year by President Park Geun-hye. Prior to this, he served as First Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Before that, he was ambassador to Belgium and the EU. Ambassador Ahn has been at the Foreign Service 36 years, so needless to say, he's done far more than I can go into in this brief introduction, and I think it's probably in all of our interests that I make the introduction as brief as possible. But suffice it to say that Ambassador Ahn is an outstanding representative of his country, a good friend of the Heritage Foundation, and he's someone that we are very proud to welcome to our stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Well, I should be beginning by thanking Heritage Foundation for organizing this seminar. And this morning I was having breakfast with one of you. And then I said to myself, it's just amazing that 200 people would be showing up for a seminar on the relationship between Korea and Japan in the middle of August. And I told him maybe that will happen only in Washington, D.C., not in any other place in the whole world. I said to him, maybe it will happen only in Washington, D.C. And I guess we owe much of it to the fact that you're organizing it at the Heritage Foundation. So thank you so much. And at the same time, I should be thanking Admiral Blair for his, well, Mr. Lohman just said it thoughtful and instructive, but at the same time, I have to say it was very inspiring. So thank you so much, Admiral Blair. And then in fact, Admiral Blair, he was depending upon issues of history. Admiral Blair was depending upon, well, even psychology, and then he was depending upon political science. So it was truly an interdisciplinary approach that, well, Admiral Blair applied to this issue between Korea and Japan. But at the same time, I have a far simpler approach, which is a practitioner's approach. So I hope that I will be able to present it in a far more, say, simpler manner. And then in order to do it, let me try to raise 3 questions and then try to answer those 3 questions as it has been observed by a practitioner of relations between Korea and Japan. My first question will be this, which is, what is the present status of relations between Korea and Japan? And then the simple answer would be not the best. And then that would be a very simple answer, which would be very easily shared by all of you in this hall. But I will have to add in the sense that if I look to the past 50 years of relationship between Korea and Japan, and then if I look to the future, coming 50 years and beyond of the relations between Korea and Japan, then I'll have to tell you, I'm more optimistic when I look upon the past and then when I look upon the future. When I look upon the past 50 years, then Korea and Japan, we normalized our relationship in 1965. So next year, we would be celebrating the 50th anniversary of normalized relations between Korea and Japan. And then during those 50 years, then there has been ups and downs. But all in all, then there has been tremendous progress in the relationship between Korea and Japan. So that is the reason why I think about the 50 years in the past. I feel very much encouraged about the relationship between our 2 countries. And then when I look to the future, coming 50 years and beyond, I'm confident that it will grow from strength to strength. Why? Because we share so many things between our 2 countries. Same values, same interests. And then, as they often say, geography is destiny. We are destined to live with each other. So when I think about all these commonalities between Korea and Japan, I'm very confident that for the coming 50 years and beyond, we will continue to develop our relationship from strength to strength. But let me stay a little bit longer on the past 50 years. As I already told you, there has been ups and downs. And then, of course, we could be applying historian's perspective. We could be applying political scientist perspective. We could be applying even a psychiatrist perspective. But at the same time, I think whatever perspective you take, there has been a certain pattern in the ups and downs. And then that pattern has been when there was more, say, readiness on the part of Japanese politicians to recognize the past as it was and take responsibility for what happened in the past, then it created a political space for Korea to bring our relationship to a higher phase. That has been a pattern that we experienced over the past 50 years. And then that is the reason why, in our view, we are deeply concerned about what is happening in the recent several years. But at the same time, as I already told you, when I think about the future, I'm very confident that we'll be able to overcome it and then continue to develop relationship between Korea and Japan. But for the time being, let me just try to think about my second question, which is, well, given the fact that we could develop our relationship in such positive manner for the past 50 years, and then we are so confident about our coming 50 years and beyond, what should be done today? That will be my second question. And then simple answer to the question would be a lot. There are so many things we could be doing together between Korea and Japan, as well as our allies like the United States. There are a lot of things we could be doing today. And then we could be doing them on two different tracks. On one track, I would call it normal track. And on another track, I would call it the track of history. And then the reason why I said it is because Korea-Japan relationship is a nation-to-nation relationship. And then between nations, we know how we can develop relationship. We can strengthen our relationship in security. We can strengthen our relationship in economy. We can strengthen our relationship in people-to-people exchange. That's what we do. I mean, that's what Korea does with 192 member countries of the United Nations. And that's what Japan does with 192 member countries of the United Nations. So that's what we must be doing, continue to develop our relationship in the normal way. And then these days, as Mr. Lohman said, I spent 36 years in Korean Foreign Service. And then these days, I often look back upon what I personally did when it comes to the relationship between Korea and Japan. And then I cannot but be reminded again and again about what I used to do when Korea joined OECD back in 1996. I personally worked glove in hand with many Japanese colleagues of mine at that time when Korea had to work very, very hard in order to join the OECD back in 1996. When I came to Korean mission to Geneva back in 1999, then I used to be responsible for human rights issues. And again, I was working very, very closely with my counterpart. At the time, it was a gentleman named Mr. Sumi, who later on now became an ambassador, of course. And then I used to work very, very closely with him on which issues? On human rights issues. And then my impression at the time was that there are a large number of member countries of the Human Rights Commission at that time. And then my impression at that time was that among countries coming from Asia, there were no other country than Japan with which we could share so many things when it comes to the human rights issues. Coming to 2002, let me remind you, I think there are an increasing number of soccer fans even in the United States. And then you would recall the World Cup football games we enjoyed a couple of weeks ago. And in 2002, Korea and Japan, we were the co-hostess of World Cup football games. It doesn't happen too often. Maybe there have been very limited number of occasions when more than one country, two countries were joint hostess. And then that happened in 2002. I personally worked on that issue. So that's the reason why I have the clear memory of Korea and Japan having been co-hostess. 2003, President of South Korea came to visit Japan. And at the time, I used to be something called Director General for International Economic Issues. And I was wondering if would be anything I could do in order to further develop relationship, normal state relationship between Korea and Japan. And I came up with this idea. I think many of you have been to Seoul, and international airport for Seoul is Incheon. But there is another airport which is far nearer, geographically far nearer to Seoul, which is at Gimpo. And I thought about Tokyo. When you come to Tokyo, international airport is at Narita. But at the same time, there is an airport which is far nearer to Tokyo, which is Haneda. So I came up with an idea. Well, between Seoul and Tokyo, why do we have to go all the way to Incheon? Why do we have to go all the way to Narita? Why can't we fly between Gimpo and Haneda? That's the idea I came up. And then we made a proposal to Japan, and then Japan liked the idea. So that's how this flight began to fly between Seoul and Tokyo. Now it is between Gimpo and Haneda, rather than Incheon and Narita. And then that is the reason why each time I flew that particular flight between Gimpo and Haneda, I felt much pride about what I did. And I was particularly encouraged when I saw high school students coming to Korea on school expedition. In fact, I could see large number of high school students coming from Japan who were coming to visit Korea, benefiting from that particular flight. And then these are the examples of some of the things I personally did in 36 years of my foreign service career. So we, in fact, have been doing many things in order to strengthen relations between Korea and Japan. And then even today we are doing them, and then we will have to keep on doing them. I mean, getting back to Admiral Blair's point, recognizing the past is important, but at the same time, we, in fact, have to continue to make efforts, practical efforts, in order to further strengthen the normal relationship between Korea and Japan. That is the first track, normal track. On the track of history, then I have to tell you this, which is that, again, I'm quoting Admiral Blair when he says, well, there are all different ways of, and then questions and issues that we should be addressing with respect to what are the issues of history. And then again, Admiral Blair was employing a kind of interdisciplinary approach about how we should be understanding issues of history. But at the same time, let me repeat to you, which is there is a very clear and then distinct pattern in the relationship between Korea and Japan for the past 50 years. That is the reason why we keep on saying that, well, in fact, I already shared with you what I personally did in 1990s and then early 21st century in order to further strengthen relations between Korea and Japan. And then one of the reasons why we cannot do that, very unfortunately these days, is because of some of very difficult statements coming from Japan, very difficult actions being made in Japan. And then that, in fact, is the reason why when we raise these issues with Japanese colleagues, then we keep on saying the importance of recognizing the past in a fair and honest manner. That, in fact, is immensely important in the relationship between Korea and Japan. So, well, as a matter of fact, I raised these kind of issues not only with Japanese colleagues, but also with large number of people in Washington, D.C. And then the other day, I was talking to one diplomat coming from Europe. And then he had a very interesting experiences behind him in the sense that he's a European diplomat, but at the same time, he studied for his own PhD degree at Tokyo University. And his dissertation was on modern history of Japan. And then on the issue of comfort women, this is what he had to say. He said, well, when it comes to issues of comfort women, the Japanese, in my view, they are suffering from the problem of their own creation. If they had accepted, if they had recognized the issue of comfort women in a fair and honest manner, the issue would have long been gone by this time. But by denying what in fact happened in the past, they are creating their own problem, and they are struggling from their own problem, and it is very painful to look upon them. As somebody who spent so many years in Japan, studying Japanese history, and then working as a professional in Japan, it is very painful to watch that. That's what I heard from that European diplomat here in Washington, D.C. So when it comes to Japanese leaders, I think there are two different kinds of Japanese leaders. I think, well, all Japanese leaders, as any leaders, they in fact would be thinking about making a proud country out of Japan. But at the same time, some of them seem to be thinking that it is through recognizing the past as it was that we in fact can make a proud country. But on the other hand, there seem to be some Japanese leaders who seem to think that it is through denial of what happened in the past that we can we can achieve the same objective. And I think, as I already told you, there has been ups and downs. And then when we have to deal with this tendency to deny what happened in the past, it makes it very difficult to strengthen our relationship in the normal track. Having said that, let me come to my third point, which is the third question, which is, well, I've been Korean ambassador to Washington for about 1 year now. And then there is one question which I come to face again and again. in various different corners of Washington, D.C. That is where we, as Americans, we look upon the relationship between Korea and Japan. What could we do in the United States to help you to improve the relationship between Korea and Japan? That's a question I received over and over again for the past 1 year. And my simple answer to the question would be this, which is more of the same. What you have been doing in the US Congress, what you have been doing in the US Department of State, what you have been doing at the White House, what you have been doing in the US think tanks, what you have been doing in the US newspapers, that in fact have been very, very helpful for us to try to improve the relations between Korea and Japan. And then why do I say that? It's because, again, I'm getting back to the point made by Admiral Blair, which is let's recognize the past fairly and honestly. And that's what President Obama has been saying again and again. When he came to Korea on April 25th, he had a press conference, and then in the press conference, that's exactly what he said. The first thing which must happen between Korea and Japan, that is to recognize the past fairly and honestly. And then that's exactly what we are telling the Japanese as well. And then that's the same message that we have been hearing from, for example, a spokesman for the Department of State who said, well, there has been prime ministers, and then there has been a chief cabinet secretary, Kono, who in fact made statements. Through those statements, they wanted to recognize the past as they were. And then that, as we know it, has been helpful. Those statements have been helpful to improve Japan's relationship with their neighbors. So that's a message coming again and again from decision makers in this town, as well as opinion makers in this town, including the Heritage Foundation. So that's the reason why I say thank you so much for what you have been doing in the United States, and then what could the United States do in order to further strengthen relations between Korea and Japan. I think you could just keep on doing what you have been doing so far. So they are my 3 points. Thank you so much.
I'm going to turn it over to Q&A here so you can start thinking about the burning questions. I know Chris Nelson has one, as always. Why don't we, we'll get you a microphone.
Thanks so much, Walter. Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Thank you to Admiral Blair, and thank you to Ambassador Ahn. Really terrific, very important statements. And I'll try to run them both in my report tomorrow so people can learn from them. Thank you so much. I did have a quick question for Walter and then a question for the panel. Was Ambassador Sesai invited, and was he not able to come for some reason to this?
No. This was an independent effort, and Ambassador Ahn expressed some interest in speaking as well. So.
Yeah, I didn't mean to turn a debate. I was just wondering.
No, it's a good clarification in case somebody wondered. Yeah.
Right. Well, I'm sure some people are. My question to Admiral Blair is, if you were, you had a lot of really useful prescriptive thinking in your speech. If you were to advise Prime Minister Abe on what he should say in order to have President Park and our Korean friends understand why he visits Yasukuni or accept that he could visit Yasukuni, what would the Prime Minister have to say that you think the Korean leadership, the Korean people could accept as okay, it's okay to go to Yasukuni? And I'm wondering from Ambassador Ahn, from what you've seen as a practitioner, do you think that it's possible to talk about Korea-Japan political reconciliation under the current Japanese leadership? Or is this something we're just going to have to wait out and hope for the best? Thank you so much.
Yeah, Chris, as I said in my remarks, the visits to the Yasukuni Shrine have achieved such a sort of overwhelming symbolism that it's hard to shred out the elements of what's true and what's not true and so on. If you read Prime Minister Abe's statements that he makes in conjunction with his visits to Yasukuni Shrine, they are very good, balanced statements, but they're drowned out by the din of the fact of showing up at that shrine with all of the controversy that many experts in this audience are more familiar with than I, the way it was established, what the museum says opposed to what the shrine says, the fact that it honors some and not others. All of that stuff has gained a size that really dwarfs whatever any Japanese prime minister can say. So as I said in my remarks, I think the way to make progress is not to try to take short-term actions that will somehow change the symbolism, because I think that's the work of generations. I think my advice to Prime Minister Abe would be to try to show his respect to the armed forces of Japan, the civilians who died in the war, in a different way, which gets at the honorable, patriotic feeling of the debt that we all owe to those who put on the uniform and fought for us, and yet is not overwhelmed by the symbolic significance of that place.
Well, with respect to the second part of the question which just came from the floor, well, I think it is not necessarily who is in power in Japan. That is something which must be decided by the citizens of Japan. It is not up to what we could or could not do. But at the same time, I think what is important is certain general understanding between Korea and Japan about what in fact would work for the best benefit of Japan, best benefit of Korea, and then best benefit of international community. And then what I think must be happening is deep understanding about certain actions being taken by Japanese leaders. And then I totally agree with Admiral Blair when he says, well, explanations are important, but at the same time, when politicians make a move, take an action, make a statement, and then the symbolism of those actions are enormously important. And I think I sincerely hope that those considerations could be made before any statement or actions are taken. And then they, in fact, would be extremely helpful in further strengthening relations between Korea and Japan. As I told you, when we have to deal with the relationship between Korea and Japan, we always have to look at the both tracks, normal track and then the track of history. And I sincerely hope that the strengthening of relations in the normal track would not be undermined by negative moves being made on the track of history.
Right there.
Steve Winters, local researcher. I'd like to ask the ambassador, I often hear the question raised in D.C. about when there might be a summit meeting between the leader of Japan and the leader of the ROK. I know the one Japanese newspaper, the Sankei Shimbun, I'm sure you're familiar with, has argued that it's quite unfair that the Koreans, according to them, are asking for preconditions to be met by Japan before such a meeting could take place. And somehow they think, why do we have to meet preconditions? We aren't asking for preconditions. Could you address that issue? Are there preconditions, or is that slowing down this possibility of a meeting?
Of course, I'll be very glad to do that. The thing is, there are meetings between Korea and Japan taking place at various different levels, at the level of ministers, at the level of director generals, at the level of military to military meetings, etc., etc. So there are a large number of meetings taking place for the time being. And then why are we having all those meetings? I think they are tools, they are instruments in order to achieve certain objectives. And I think we should apply a rather practical mind in the sense that summit meeting, of course it can be there, but at the same time, if summit meeting is going to be there, then we should have certain assurance that those meetings, in fact, would go in the direction further strengthening relations between Korea and Japan. Because let's just assume if a summit meeting has been announced, then there would be certain expectation created. And then that expectation would be, well, when our two leaders meet, then of course we will move to a place which would be better than where we are today. And then that level of expectation, if it is met, then that will be good. But at the same time, if it is not met, then there will be another occasion of frustration. And frustration go in the direction of undermining the relationship between Korea and Japan rather than improving it. So I wouldn't call it a precondition. I would call it common sense.
All the way in the back. The blue shirt, yeah.
I'm Yoshi Komori of the Sankei Shimbun that the gentleman there mentioned. Since Ambassador Ahn emphasized the importance of the so-called comfort women issue, among other issues related to history, I feel a little compelled to make a couple comments about truth searching and soul searching of the issue on the Japanese side, and ask for your comment again. Okay, I think everyone agrees that essence of the charge against Japan in the present and past on the issue is the contention that the Japanese military systematically coerced the recruitment of the innocent women. And evidence after research showed in Japan, there's no such thing. There was one known isolated case where officers of the Japanese Imperial Army forcibly recruited or coerced the Dutch lady for the prostitution in Indonesia. Only after 2 months that was suspended and by the higher authority of Japanese command, and the officer in charge punished. By the way, this officer was executed after the end of the war by the Dutch authorities. Okay, so so again and again, the Japanese understanding is just no systematic coercion as a policy. And just most recently, 10 days ago, the Asahi Shimbun, which has been perhaps the most seriously dependent upon source of, single most dependent upon source of information for the critics of Japan on the issue, published a major retraction of the contention that the paper had been pushing previously for the past 30 years. Okay. But in essence, the retraction is, okay, I'm going to stop, yeah, okay. There's no evidence for military coercion. Okay, so again and again, so what would you say to this most recent retraction and then the background that I just briefly explained and what goes on in Japan?
Well, I'm so glad we have someone with 36 years of diplomatic experience to handle that question. Even so, you might need a second to cool down. So, you know, we've got a lot of people here that could probably answer the question as well, but Ambassador Ahn, why don't you?
Well, as a matter of fact, that question coming from Sankei Shimbun correspondent, it reminds me about something called review commission commission on Kono statement. And then when this idea first came up from the Japanese government that they would be, in a sense, establishing this review commission on the Kono statement, then our idea was, well, what are you going to do with respect to the Kono statement? Are you going to maintain it or are you going to modify it? And then the answer was, we are going to maintain it. And then our second question was, well, if that is the case, then what is going to be the mission or the mandate for the review commission? And then they said, the response we received was that it is in order to further strengthen the basis or the basis of the Kono statement. And then when that review commission came up with a report, there was not a little bit of disappointment on the part of Korea. Why? Because on the one hand, then we heard the Chief Cabinet Secretary of Japan stating that we will continue to support the Kono statement. But at the same time, what is the Kono statement? There were 3 elements in the Kono statement in my mind. The first element was coercion. Coercion in the sense that Japanese military, it in fact was responsible for the management of military brothel during the imperial period. Second point was admission of enormous pain, which has been caused to the members of military brothel. That was the second point. Third point was because of the Japanese authorities' engagement and because of this enormous pain which have been caused to the members of the brothel, Japanese government or Japanese people are under heavy moral responsibility arising from that. There were the three elements. And then we, in fact, went through the report of the review commission. And then, well, somehow the message was the coercion, it was exaggerated. I wouldn't go into the details, but what is suggested was that coercion was exaggerated. And then there is the reason why we couldn't fully understand what was the motivation for setting up the commission in the first place. And then in the second place, if they are saying that the element of coercion, in fact, there is something to be questioning the elements of coercion, then in fact, how could you say we will stand by the corner statement? So that, in fact, is the reason why, well, let me remind you, one of the points which Admiral Blair has made was somehow there is an impression in Japan that, well, somehow these issues of history for which Japan makes, well, takes responsibility again and again, but somehow Korea does not accept those responsibilities and keep on raising the issue of responsibility. Well, as a matter of fact, that view is around, I know that, but at the same time, if you look at these instances like this element of coercion, which in fact has been more than sufficiently well established through various different channels, is being questioned again and again, and then that from time to time by Japanese authorities, and then that is the reason why, in fact, we cannot let history be the history and then move ahead. And then that is the reason why we keep on saying in Korea that denial would not be helpful. Acceptance of fact would, in fact, be the starting point, and it must be the starting point. Thank you.
Could I just add a more general point? The history of Asia from the sort of the 1930s to about 1955 and so was not pretty in any way that you can think about it. There were a series of brutal acts taken on a large scale by many countries against many countries. There were an awful lot of innocent victims. There were some victims who weren't innocent. It was a nasty place for a long time. I don't think any country can have a monopoly on righteousness or on guilt and shame in the events of those 50 years. And what I was trying to say is that the attempting to hold a we were right sweepstakes and you were wrong sweepstakes is not going to help any of the countries concerned over the long term, or our children or grandchildren, to understand what happened there, to be able to incorporate it into their memories and their histories of their families, their fathers, their grandparents, their aunts, their mothers, and move on to hopefully a better approach which won't kill and brutalize so many people, but will allow other people to do it. And it seems to me that this issue is so much bigger than is whether on one particular date at one particular time something happened or didn't happen, that we're you know, playing around with shoelaces when we have a huge set of major issues that we have to deal with. So I guess what I'm talking about is trying to get a large overall understanding of this period in which there were some heroes who attempted to keep bad things from happening, or who refused to carry out orders that were barbaric and were against their creeds. There were some who went ahead and did it. There were many who did nothing and didn't know about it, or wish they did, or perhaps could have made a difference. And it's that sort of understanding of what went on that I think is the key to moving on, and which will not be solved by simply, oh yes, Government A was responsible for Act B, Government C was responsible for Act D. Those are part of it, but the big thing is to achieve this understanding. And I would really hope that this anniversary coming up next year of the 70th anniversary of the end of the largest of those wars would be an occasion when we could sort of take a step to understand the full extent of what went on then, and the good bad and the ugly out of it, and then move forward to a better future.
Yeah, just really briefly, I just wanted to say that, I think the frustration that some of us face that are sort of stuck in the middle here is that we spend a lot of time telling our Korean friends that the Japanese have already dealt with this. They've already apologized 60 times or whatever the count is. And to some extent, that's true, But then questions like that raise, raise the possibility, raise the prospect that actually you haven't. And so we get stuck in the middle because I think to a large extent, it's true the government has officially dealt with the issue. But as long as you keep reopening it, take every opportunity to reopen it, then that's when we have problems. That's when we have the ups and downs that Ambassador Ahn mentioned over the last 50 years.
Yeah, well, they should be reopened in a sense of understanding, but to use it as a political instrument time and again, I think is what is
Yes.
keeping us from making progress.
Yes, exactly. Yes, right here.
Yeah, thank you. Mike Billington from Executive Intelligence Review. Ambassador, and perhaps also Admiral Blair, I think it's clear that many people here in the U.S. are anxious for Japan-Korea collaboration because they want them to be joining forces against China. This is reflected with the effort to get the THAAD missiles deployed, which the Koreans believed was deployed against China, not North Korea, and the recent effort to prevent Korea from joining with China's Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank proposals. So I'd like you to address this. I know that Korea views their relations with China and Russia as crucial for both getting peace in the peninsula and also for long-term economic development. So if you could address that side of this issue, please.
Well, it is true that the economic relations between Korea and and China is getting more important. And then I think it was several weeks ago there was an article in the Washington Post written by one former very high-ranking government official of Japan. And then I was quite, in a sense, disappointed, would be the word, disappointed to read that article in the sense that, well, it was on a very simplistic theme, which was, well, there is increasing economic relationship between Europe and Russia, and that is one of the reasons why European countries are not responding sufficiently strongly against the Russian action in Ukraine. And it made a logical jump, and it said, well, there is increasing economic relations between Korea and China, and then because of it, there is a risk that the relationship between Korea and then the United States could be undermined. That former high government official, in fact, used even the expression of Finlandization, and then that is the reason why I was very, very disappointed with that article in the sense that, well, if it was just one of lazy thinkers coming up with such an article, I would understand it. But at the same time, that in fact was contributed by somebody who used to be in a very responsible position. Then I was thinking about it, which is that what must be the strategic relationship between Korea and Japan. And then in my presentation, I was emphasizing again and again about common values and then common interests that we share between Korea and Japan. And those kind of statements coming from, say, somebody who used to be in the responsible position in the Japanese government, it could very likely have a self-fulfilling effect upon the relationship among important countries in the region. And I truly believe that is not going to happen at all, undermining of relationship between Korea and the United States because of increasing economic relationship between Korea and China. That, as I already said, is very simplistic. And then I have to remind you, as well as remind myself, that security alliance, the security partnership, the only country with which Korea has that alliance relationship is with the United States. And then, well, which issue would be more important for a country rather than maintaining a security? And then when we think about it, then of course there is only one. I could come up with hundreds of reasons why it is simplistic, but it will be one a very powerful reason why we don't think it is going to happen at all. And then I'm very glad to share with you that in fact is the statements being made by Department of State as well as White House in the sense that, well, there is no zero-sum relationship, and then it is not going to undermine Korea's relationship with the United States. not even by 1 iota. Thank you.
Let me ask one question here, because Admiral Blair, I don't want to miss the opportunity to ask you about this particularly. Is if you could comment on the new guidelines on self-defense, on collective self-defense from Japan, and how it where it fits in the needs for U.S. activity in the region.
All right, I'll be glad to talk about that. Well, let me just add a quick item. I don't want to let this idea stand that the United States is somehow wants to get Japan and Korea together to form an anti-Chinese coalition. That simply is not what the American interest is in this situation. China is attempting an approach in East Asia which involves trying to gain bilateral advantage in a series of individual relationships with countries, and it prefers to operate as sort of a spoken wheel strategy in which it will pursue its relations and its interests with individual countries and try to increase them as its advantage increases. The United States, Korea, and Japan, I think, are all countries which believe in appealing to common principles which should apply to all countries, large or small, in economic and security and territorial disputes and the whole rest of it. So I think what the ambassador was saying about common values has to do with these values of the way that we approach problems, and that we believe that security and prosperity should be achieved in the region by compromise, by larger principles that we all apply to. And I think in that sense, that's why we want the democratic countries of Korea and Japan to have better relations with each other, so that they can work together to support these principles, which we think apply to making progress in that part of the world. On collective self-defense, as I mentioned in my remarks, I think that Japan has very fine military equipment, very well-trained officers and men, and an absolutely abysmal system for bringing that to bear in support of Japanese and common interests around the world, because it's built on this set of principles and interpretation of the Constitution that were set up 50 years ago under entirely different circumstances. And I think that every step that Japan can take to give its armed forces more flexibility to be used by the government to solve Japan's security problems and common security problems, participating in peacekeeping operations, participating in disaster relief, helping deter North Korea and so on, is a step to the good. And so I think the steps that have been taken recently are in the right direction, and I hope that they continue. And they shouldn't be confused with a return to 1930s-style militarism in Japan. Japan of today is so far from that, from putting the chrysanthemums back on the bows of the ships, that I can't even imagine it. And I've operated with the Japanese self-defense forces for many years. So I'd like to separate these two questions of getting the history right and Japan having an armed forces which will operate, I'm sure, as has Japanese policy over the last 70 years, in a very responsible and peaceful manner.
Thank you. We're going to have to leave it there with our distinguished keynote presenters here. I hope you'll save your questions. We've got plenty of people who can discuss with you further. But in the meantime, I hope you could join me in thanking Ambassador Ahn and Admiral Blair for being with us today. Well, I think we'll get started here. If you could take your seats, get restarted. As I say, plenty of room here for continued conversation with our experts. We've got a couple panels to further discuss the issue. I'm going to go through and introduce the first three here. We'll have them present for 10 minutes or so. They're welcome to stay seated or come up to the podium, whichever is their preference, and then we'll have some Q&A before the next panel. Our first panelist is Lee Sun-young. Dr. Lee is Kim-ku Korea Foundation Professor in Korean Studies and Assistant Professor at the Fletcher School. Dr. Lee, on your bio, you list quite a few publications, like anyone does in our sort of business here, if we have a lot to list. But one you didn't mention is a piece you co-authored about a year and a half ago in the Washington Post regarding North Korea's palace economy and the need to go after it. You co-authored that piece, in fact, and that's the first thing that really caught my attention and really alerted me to your extraordinary contribution you have to make to debates here in Washington. You also then delivered a star performance in a conference that we co-hosted in Korea with Chosun Ilbo and the Hansen Foundation. We're very glad to have you back this time in the stage here in Washington to share your views with us. After Dr. Lee, we're going to turn to Scott Snyder. Scott has been here before and shared his great insights with us. Scott is a senior fellow for Korea Studies and director of the program on U.S. Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's very well known and respected around here on Korea and in Korea policy circles, Asia policy generally. He's very widely published, including in an ongoing blog entitled Asia Unbound, CFR's blog. He's been there since 2008, before that at the Asia Foundation and CSIS Pacific Forum out in Hawaii. You can't telecommute to Hawaii, right? You got to be there to do it. So hardship duty in Hawaii. Yeah. And then we're going to turn to Yuki Tatsumi. Yuki is senior associate at the Stimson Center, where she's been since 2004. This is actually Yuki's second time to Heritage this year, in fact. She was here in March to talk about U.S. Japan cooperation in Southeast Asia. This is a bit bigger crowd than we managed to get together that day, I think, as you'll remember. And I don't think we had as many cameras for Southeast Asia. But before that, Yuki was at CSIS. Yuki's also very widely published and really a go-to person in Washington on the Japanese perspective, which is testified by the fact that she's here and she's feeling a little bit lonely in a whole group of Korea experts and Korea-interested people. So we very much appreciate you being here, Yuki, and sharing your perspective with us. So with that, I'm going to ask Dr. Lee. I think he has a preference to come here and speak, and then we'll move on from there. Thank you.
During the U.S. occupation of Japan, 1945 to 1952, if the United States had followed Japanese actions in colonial Korea, 1910 to 1945, the United States may have pursued the following actions. 1, prohibit the speaking of the Japanese language in Japanese schools and force Japanese to speak English. 2, start the school day with the singing of the American national anthem. 3, subsume Japanese history under the narrative arc of American history. 4, dominate all government sectors, industry, and society as American overlords, as absentee landlords. 5th, impose on Japan Protestant Christianity as the official Japanese religion. 6th, conscript Japanese men to carry out America's wars elsewhere, for instance, in Korea, 1950 to 1953. Forcibly repatriate Japanese laborers to come to work in American mines and factories and fields, and also forcibly coerce Japanese women and young girls to work in American military brothels elsewhere. We know that America did none of these things. America did quite the opposite, which was to give generously to Japan approximately $2 billion during the occupation years, about the sum equal approximately to the Japanese national budget during those very difficult post-war years. America's unwillingness to impose on Japan a punitive peace, its generosity, the philosophical pragmatism of the Japanese leadership, and the hard work of the Japanese people, to a great extent, explain the success of the U.S. occupation and the overall health of the bilateral relationship over the past 69 years. So you might say that at the end of the day, pragmatism prevailed. Why can't we apply this model toward the Korea-Japan relationship? Yes, pragmatism prevailed, but in my view, as hard as we may try to approach the study and the practice of international relations through a pragmatic or even an amoral perspective, an amoral view of history, there are some issues that defy understanding or resolution on pragmatism alone. There are some historical issues that defy resolution on legality or legalese, a formal diplomatic treaty, and the issue of comfort women, as all of you know, a grotesque euphemism for institutionalized military sexual slavery, is one of those issues. The English philosopher and historian Robin George Collingwood, R.G. Collingwood, defines history thus: history is the idea of thoughts, and the idea of thoughts, history is, all history is the history of thoughts, and the history of thoughts, therefore, is the reenactment of the past thought in the historian's mind. Collingwood goes further to explain that to the scientist, nature is always and merely a phenomenon, not in the sense of being defective in reality, but in the sense of being a spectacle presented to his observation. Whereas the events of history are never mere phenomena, never mere spectacle for contemplation, but things which the historian looks not at, but through, to discern the thought within them. I think the very contentious, difficult issue of comfort women and Japan's recent fudging on this deeply disturbing emotional issue is an example of the Japanese leadership not having yet shown a sincere effort to discern the thought, the essence, the true emotional, the true human aspect of this historical issue. We have occasional apologies. The Japanese government even keeps account of the number of official apologies for Japan's past aggression visited upon Korea and other countries. But we know that other unfortunate statements, occasional statements, and actions by the top Japanese leadership have repeatedly undermined those previous apologies. The Japanese public deserves better. Japan is a first-rate nation, an advanced democracy. Henry Kissinger, more than 35 years ago, about 34 years after the end of the war in the late 70s, Kissinger, in his memoir, The White House Years, said, quote, "Japanese actions and decisions have been by far the most intelligent and far-sighted of all the major nations in the post-war era." White House Years, Boston, Little Brown, 1979, page 324, I believe. I fully agree with that assessment, and I think Mr. Kissinger, now 35 years after having made that statement, would still agree. But Japan, of course, some of its official statements on Yasukuni and the comfort women issue are not shared around the world. President Obama, as Mr. Ambassador Ahn just a few minutes ago mentioned, on his visit to South Korea in late April, when asked by a Korean reporter on this question, President Obama said that even in the midst of war, by the standards of war, this was a terrible, quote, "a terrible and egregious human rights violation, quite shocking." I think that resonates, not to suggest that President Obama or any single individual is the supreme arbiter of moral justice. But I think that message is right on and it resonates throughout much of the world. Therefore, for Japan to fudge on this very difficult, disturbing issue is a self-defeating proposition. Prime Minister Abe's visit to Yasukuni Shrine last December 26, 2013, was in a way a gift, unexpected gift, to Japan's adversaries, China and North Korea. In my humble opinion, it brought no tangible benefit to the Japanese government. It exasperated Japan's sole and key ally, the United States, and of course, increased the tension with South Korea. On October 3rd last year, Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel visited a different cemetery in Tokyo and laid a wreath in honor of fallen Japanese soldiers during World War II. It was a dramatic gesture of peace and respect, and the two men in so doing showed that there is a proper way to honor Japan's war dead without resorting to political theater, which is a visit to the Yasukuni Shrine by the top Japanese leader. At the same time, South Korea should see that when it comes to its national security, Japan is South Korea's tacit ally. As much as China may tempt to convince South Korea to align with itself in a joint opposition coalition against Japan based on the common history of victimization, South Korea should resist that overture. President Xi, during his visit to South Korea in early July, spoke at Seoul National University, and he invoked a historical war, a war in which China and Korea fought shoulder to shoulder against a common foe, Japan. A war that ravaged the nation, a war in which the major foreign combatants had operational command, exercised operational command, a war that saw China cross the Yalu River, confining its adversary to the southern half of the peninsula, a war that ended without clear-cut victory, without indemnity, yet a war in which the Koreans clearly were the biggest losers. A war that took 400 years ago. Japan today is not the feudal kingdom during those years. South Korea today is not the isolationist Korean monarchy 400 years ago. The more appropriate war analogy for President Xi to have invoked would have been the Korean War of 1950 to 1953, a war that President Xi in 2010 called just and great. Well, as transparent as President Xi's effort may have been, it was also transparent that this was a false analogy, yet the effort to bring South Korea on board against China is an ongoing diplomatic tool exercised quite ably by the Chinese leadership. There is a precedent for this. In 2005, when Shimane Prefecture declared Takeshima Day, the then South Korean president, Roh Moo-hyun, came out in late March and said, we are on the verge of a very difficult diplomatic war against Japan. Park Geun-hye, who was the chairwoman of the opposition party, rebuked President Roh's statement, yet his approval rating spiked up within a matter of days from 20% to 48%. A clear precedent had been set. Fanning the flames of anti-Japanese sentiment really works in Korean politics. As myopic and arguably strategically self-defeating as that posture may be, it really works, and it is very difficult for the South Korean elected leader to shun that kind of domestic dynamic in Korean domestic politics. Park Geun-hye has yet to rise to a great statesman, but I think she will. I expect her to overcome this historical inhibition, this historical tension with Japan, and perhaps as early as this fall, to exercise leadership and reach out to Japan. But Japanese leaders must also remember that to the South Korean public, the essence, the thought within the historical incidents of the past defy resolution by apology or legal diplomatic treaty alone, because that history is fraught with crimes, misfortunes, and follies that require no falsification or dramatization and that remain decidedly not forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to join this panel at Heritage Foundation today. Although I do have to say that I am a little bit uncomfortable. First, I drew the short end of the stick and got on the history panel instead of the future panel that were coming up next. And of course, I'm sitting in the middle of two good friends, Sung-Yoon and Yuki, and we've worked together on various things at various times. So I couldn't help but thinking that's a little bit analogous to the position that the U.S. is in with regards to history issues between Japan and South Korea. And then as I was preparing for the talk, of course, as a good Korea watcher, I was reading about Pope Francis in Korea and all of the things that he's been saying. And in his last Mass, he talked about hopes for the inter-Korean relationship, but he didn't actually say anything about South Korea-Japan relations. And so it made me feel like this is really a godforsaken topic, very challenging to address. What I want to do in my remarks is, first, I just want to say something. My presentation, in contrast to Admiral Blair's, which was excellent, is I think his was very realistic and holistic, and I would say that I'm going to focus more on identity and specific sets of challenges. And one other observation that I just have to draw from his speech is that I think he gave a classic American view of history, but one of the things that I was taught in an early class in Asian history from an Asian professor is that in the West, we look at history as the empirical record of what happened. In the East, it's about moral views, and it's about moral judgments. And that actually, I think, helps to further explain why this set of issues is actually so difficult between Japan and South Korea. And then I've been doing some work on Japan-South Korea relations, and of course, the realistic view, the realism view, international relations is that Japan and South Korea have common interests in the context of a Chinese threat. I think that was implicit in Admiral Blair's presentation. But then you start to scratch on these history issues, and it really is, I think, impeded by the fact that we have contending identity-based claims that are part of the narrative, the historical narrative in terms of how South Koreans and Japanese are viewing each other. And Admiral Blair mentioned An Chung-gun. That's a good example. One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. The most recent Genron NPO EAI poll from this summer shows that in South Korea, the view of Japan is that Japan doesn't Japanese people have a poor understanding of Japan's invasion of Asian countries. And the history textbook issue, which is really an identity-based issue. It's about whether or not Japan is recognizing South Korean dignity. And on the Japanese side, it's, well, the South Koreans are showing excessive anti-Japanese activities, and they're having too many campaigns, anti-Japanese campaigns in terms of education and school books. And this is really about impugning dignity from a Japanese perspective. And so I think that that is really the core of it in many respects, and it's very deep. Over the course of the past year or so, what I see happening on the U.S. side is that the U.S. government has been drawn into this, really, I think, to an unprecedented degree. Historically, I think the U.S. tried to play a kind of even-handed role and didn't get too involved. But I notice, as I look back and think back on the past year, Assistant Secretary Danny Russell from July of 2013, before Prime Minister Abe visited Yasukuni, talked about how it's hugely important that the relations between Japan and its neighbors improve and that problems be dealt with in a peaceful and thoughtful way. And I think that as we see the preparations for President Obama bringing President Park and Prime Minister Abe together at The Hague, there's a heavy involvement, actually, by the U.S. government in trying to create the conditions that would be necessary for that meeting to occur, including essentially laying the groundwork for the Japanese government's commitment to respect the Kono and Murayama statements. And so that brings me actually to another point, and that is that in my view, in order to stabilize the relationship, I think the U.S. will continue to be involved, but one of the tasks, I think, on the U.S. side is going to be to try to hold both Japan and South Korea to a non-revisionist approach. And for Japan, it's about history. I think that for Korea, actually, it's going to end up being about maintaining the 1965 Normalization Treaty as the basis for moving forward in the relationship. And so it's going to be very challenging, I think, because the U.S. is engaged and involved to a great degree. Now, the third point is I have friends who look at this Japan-South Korea relationship and they say, well, the best we can do is to just manage it. We can't possibly expect that it could be resolved. But I find that to be quite depressing as a conclusion, because I still see a great deal of potential for the Japan-South Korea relationship and for the trilateral relationship with the United States. And so I feel compelled to put out, a vision for the Japan-South Korea relationship that probably would involve the kind of political will that Admiral Blair was talking about. I would call it statesmanship, whereby, my vision would be that Japan would make a grand gesture that could be interpreted by South Korea in a positive way and accepted and affirmed. And I think that the way of thinking about what is really necessary in order to move the relationship forward in that way is actually to go back to the 1998 Kim Dae-jung-Obuchi Joint Partnership Agreement between South Korea and Japan. And at that time, the two sides agreed to build a quote-unquote solid, good neighborly, and friendly relationship in the 21st century that squarely faces the past and develop relations based on mutual understanding and trust, moving forward in a future-oriented relationship. Now, what was the effect of the 1998 Japan-South Korea agreement on the respective publics? Well, it's very interesting. If you go back and look at public opinion polls, in Japan, that joint partnership, it really moved the needle. It moved Japanese public opinion into positive territory about South Korea for the first time. And it stayed in positive territory until 2012. But unfortunately, on the South Korean side, it did not move South Korean public opinion into positive territory. So I would suggest that the challenge is really to find a formulation whereby both sides can move this into positive territory. Then there's the question of timing, and this is really my last point, and it's directly related to, again, the issue of identity. And that is that, especially when Americans talk about Japan-South Korea relations, we tend to move in the direction of thinking about mutuality, steps that both sides can take with each other. But I think it's worth asking and reflecting on for our Japanese and South Korean colleagues. Is it necessarily the case that for Japan to move forward on these issues, it requires a South Korean affirmation? And for our South Korean colleagues, is it really the case that for South Korea to grapple with some of the the challenges in terms of its own identity, that it needs a movement by Japan. And essentially what I'm getting to is that identity may turn out to be more about self, more about the national conception than about others. And so eventually maybe we'll move in the direction of mutuality. I certainly hope so. But I also think that it will only be productive if it is the result of a process of self-reflection in both societies that enables those societies to come to a point when they're actually ready to move forward. And here is where I also found the Pope's remarks in Seoul to be interesting, because he talked about peace is not simply the absence of war, but the work of justice. And a lot of these issues are about perceptions of justice. And justice as a virtue calls for the discipline of forbearance. It demands that we not forget past injustices, but overcome them through forgiveness, tolerance, and cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you.
I was actually going to do it from my seat, but then these both two gentlemen set the good precedents for me, so I thought I would follow the suit. Good afternoon. First, I would like to start by thanking Walter and Bruce and the Heritage Foundation for hosting me here. This actually big conference room has a particular memory attached to my slave labor days, if you will. That about 10, 15 years ago, you used to host a group of Japanese Diet members, former defense ministers, in this particular auditorium to have a panel discussion about various different things. And I was in that room that doesn't even have a window, doing the interpretation. So me standing here today, speaking to all of you alone is, frankly, my own self-achievement. So I feel pretty good about this today. So thank you again for hosting me. And then also, in absentia, I would really like to thank Ambassador Ahn, because I'm one of the beneficiary of the Kimpo Haneda airline too. So I didn't have a chance to personally thank him, but it really made so many of Japanese scholars and my Korean colleagues who works on the bilateral relations intellectual exchange a lot faster, a lot easier, and a lot cheaper. So very, very thankful for that too. Because the day of Japan's unconditional surrender, August 15th, was just this past Friday, I think this theme of reconciliation between Japan and ROK are a very, very timely topic, as sensitive as it may be. And as I speak today, I'm mindful of a speech delivered by President Park Geun-hye last Friday. And then I was also very, I was cautiously encouraged by that speech as well. In that speech, President Park, of course, she continued to call for the Japanese leaders to take, quote, correct views of history, unquote, and to take, again, quote, proactive measures acceptable to the comfort women victims of the Japanese imperial military while they are still alive, unquote. She still did express her hope for the next year. The 70th anniversary of the end of the World War II will be the year in which Japan and Korea builds relationship for the future. And I would also like to remind you that, and then of course many of you know this, so it probably doesn't need being reminded, that the Prime Minister Abe did refrain from visiting Yasukuni Shrine that particular day. He instead visited Chidoriga-Fuji, which is alternative secular site, a war memorial that honors and pay respects for all war dead in the last war. And he also attended the memorial ceremony also at the secular site. And he did, in his speech, he talked about Japan's need to, quote, face history with humility and engrave deeply into our hearts the lessons that we should learn, unquote. The theme of this panel is unresolved history issues strain Seoul-Tokyo relations. And because these issues, as we have already seen a little bit of it up to the proceeding up to now, that these issues are often very emotionally charged when they are raised and discussed. I would like to add, to the extent possible, in my opening remarks at least, try to step back a little bit, to the extent possible, of course. So today I have two things that I would like to raise in my humble remarks for you today. The first is And then those are the two issues that I'm mainly going to go through. First is why we are where we are. The second is what both sides will have to keep in mind as the two countries really work toward get the bilateral relationship on track, if you will. And one takeaway that I would hope that all of you in this room would leave this event today is that the responsibility to bring this current relationship back on track are on both sides, although with a very different angle. So why? Why does Japan-Korea relations continue to be constrained by the history? I'm risking oversimplification here, but let me offer the following. Because it is often easier for some political leaders of both countries to hide behind these unresolved history issues. As long as they continue to blame each other for the status quo and they're the cause of this current status quo, they can continue to evade, to do what politically may not be popular, but is necessary things to change the status quo. On the part of Japan, it may be easier to lay the blame on ROK for the status quo by continuing to say that its leaders and media prefers to demonize Japan to score political points within the country, that it is not genuinely interested in reconciliation. The most prevalent frustration that I hear in Tokyo nowadays, whenever I go visit, is Koreans have continued to move the goalposts. They refuse to define the resolution of history issues, and we're not playing that game anymore. I think this is kind of by and large the summation of what some of us nowadays start to refer to as a Korea fatigue in Japan. But on the ROK's part, on the other hand, it also may be just as easy to put complete blame on Japan for the status quo. That Japan has not repented enough for its wartime sins, that the past efforts made by Japan was either insufficient or insincere. However, continue to blame each other in this way will not change anything, as we all know. It will make things only worse, as we all know. And I submit that both sides have chosen to dismiss or to overlook certain actions by the other, and also condone the developments within their own country that may touch sensitivities in the other. And let me talk a little bit about what I mean by that. So for Japan, for a long time, Japan emphasized and held the position that the wartime compensation issue has been legally resolved between the two governments when two governments signed a Japan-ROK agreement regarding the compensation claims and economic cooperation in 1965. This is one of the side agreements that were signed when the two countries normalized its diplomatic relations in 1965. While that is legally maybe accurate and true, it may have been slow its leaders may have been slow to recognize that there might be humanitarian elements to many of those issues that may need additional care. And also it seems that some Japanese political leaders may not appreciate as much as they could how certain words and deeds by well-known political leaders and public and quasi-public political figures on the history issue will be perceived within the ROK, or actually nowadays ROK and beyond. For instance, there's frustration that in Japan that those who try to deny Japan's wartime atrocities are a distinct minority, and ROK folk choose to focus too much on those fringe voices. And I do have to acknowledge that a silent majority in Japan is moderate. They do want to feel proud of their country, but they also feel remorse about what Japan has did before 1945. However, I am also aware that until not too long ago, any Japanese politician cannot stay in senior positions in the government if they make any insensitive remarks about the history. Because as soon as they said something, either they were forced to resign or they submit the resignation letter before they were forced to do so. And a little has been discussed how something like that has kind of stopped somehow. And there may be it's a small thing, on its own. But maybe that small things like that may affect how Korean perceives Japan in terms of its effort of its atonement with the past. On the same token, I don't know whether there's the appreciation within Japan that how this, fudging, as Dr. Lee called it, on the comfort woman issue or examination of the process of shaping the 1993 Keynote statement, or the voices within LDP to push for launch of formal investigation about the Asahi newspaper reporting 30 years ago. How those developments within Japan, again, how those developments may be perceived outside Japan. At the same time, I also do like to raise that ROK has also chosen to dismiss certain efforts made by the Japanese government in the past. For example, between 2009 and 2012, when Japan was under the government ruled by the Democratic Party of Japan, during those 3 years, 3 different Japanese prime ministers made different types of overtures towards South Korea. Prime Minister Ahn issued the new statement on the centennial of the Japan's annexation of Korea, reiterating the apology. Prime Minister Noda, and also inheriting from Prime Minister Ahn, the DPJ governments offered to return the cultural documents or artifacts that Japan has taken from E Dynasty during the colonial times. And what did the Japanese government get in return from South Korea? ROK government walked away from General Security of Information Agreement at the 11th hour of its negotiation. And we also have a President Lee Myung-bak landed on Takeshima. Again, these actions coming out of Seoul was perceived in Japan as the examples of how maybe ROK government is not genuinely interested in reconciliation. Although I know my time is limited, let me just say, because woman issue has been raised and caused some stirks, it would be remiss if I don't mention this. Let me just say a few words about Asia Women's Fund. Even among I raise this issue because even among American friends, I have heard some dismissive comments about this fund, saying that it was the effort that had no significance or mere feel-good effort by only a few. While there may be ways in which Japanese government could have implemented this fund a little bit differently, I simply do not accept such trivialization of the fund and what it tried to do during its operation. Former Prime Minister Murayama, who should be credited for 1995 Murayama statement, said in his recent interview that he does not believe that reconciliation can be achieved by just signing a treaty. And I think this is running through the theme of what Admiral Blair talked about, Ambassador Blair talked about, Ambassador Ahn talked about, and also Dr. Lee talked about. He believes that those who inflicted harm should make sincere effort to atone with what it has done in the past. In my mind, the establishment of Asia Women Fund was the product of Murayama government's maximum effort to search for a solution that allows Japan to help address that human aspect of the comfort woman issue, while upholding the government's official position that the issue of wartime compensation was legally settled. The fund was a joint effort by government and Japanese people, and in fact, a great number of ordinary Japanese citizens contributed to this fund. And then it is little known that when there was a cash compensation that was called atonement money, that was accepted by comfort women victims, there was a letter personally signed by the Prime Minister of Japan during that time. And I want to point out that this personally signed letter was signed by 4 consecutive prime ministers, starting from Hashimoto, then Obuchi, and Mori, and Koizumi. And again, going back to former Prime Minister Murayama, in an interview that I just referred to, also talked about the mutuality or mutual responsibility between the aggressor and the victim. He talked about while those who inflicted harm should make sincere efforts, the victim side also, once it is convinced that the former transgressor is making serious efforts to come to terms with his past behavior, it needs to be open and receptive to these efforts and reciprocate. The 1997 joint declaration between President Kim Dae-jun and Prime Minister Keizo Obuchi that Scott just mentioned, I believe was a product of enormous political courage on the part of both of those leaders. And then I do think it is the lack of this kind of political courage, both in Tokyo and Seoul, that continues to allow history to hamper the bilateral relations to where it is today. So what can we do about it? I was just reading the article in Foreign Affairs by Dr. Legvold. I guess he's a scholar in the pro-Soviet Russian foreign policy the other day. He offered the following 3 lessons learned from the Cold War between the US and Russia. First, both sides need to recognize that mistrust often distorts each other's perception of others' intentions. Second, the 2 sides should stop blaming the other side and instead step back and consider what is that they each have done to contribute to the current tension. Finally, more attention needs to be paid on influencing each other's policy choices by shaping events rather than trying to change each other's way of seeing things. Now, I do not mean to suggest that the tension between Japan and ROK are at that level of Cold War between US and Soviet Union, but I do think that there are some elements of applicability in these lessons learned that I just mentioned. First, on mistrust distorts the perception on each other's intention part. One particular example that immediately comes to my mind is the Korean criticism of Japan's ongoing efforts to revise its constitutional interpretation on the right of collective self-defense. Not surprisingly, these developments have been criticized largely as a part of Japan's efforts to remilitarize. Actually, not too long, several months ago, when I was actually serving on the other panel discussion elsewhere in DC as a discussant, one Korean journalist actually raised the point that Koreans are still worried that Japan will again invade Korea again. I was just a discussant, so I wanted to defer the floor to the main speaker, so I didn't raise it at that time. But I really do like to challenge anyone to come up with a plausible scenario under which something like that occur. And by the way, for something that outlandish to occur, US has to condone it. So I really challenge, for those of you who has that notion that Japan may somehow invade Korea again, would like to show me to convince me the plausible scenario under which that thing is possible. On the need for 2 sides to stop blaming the other side part, I think I have already spent a fair amount in my early remarks, so I'll just leave it at that, but I would be happy to discuss further in Q&A. Finally, need for greater focus on shaping each other's policy option by shaping events, rather than try to change the ideas. So it may never, after all these bad bloods have been shed and everything underwater, it may never be possible for Prime Minister Abe and President Park to be best friends among the world leaders. But that is okay. But if you agree, though, with not only with me, but Admiral Blair, Ambassador Ahn, my co-panelist, in the proposition that Japan and ROK do need each other, not only because they need each other to respond to the immediate crisis in North Korea, but also as a fellow democracy in East Asia, to play a larger strategic role within the US ongoing efforts to strategically rebalance the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. It will be irresponsible for both leaders to let the current divide prolong, and other political leaders in the 2 countries to do or say things to aggravate the current tension. And in closing, I do find it encouraging that the government officials throughout all these difficult times, government officials in both countries who have to manage these relations day by day, have always wanted this relationship to work. And they really persevered. There are already encouraging signs on both sides that the political environment in both countries may be a little bit more, is turning more permissive for the governments to engage. And I do hope that these developments will continue, and then I do hope that they are encouraged by their political leaders. And I would end here.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, let me open the floor to questions. There were several left over from before that are probably still relevant to the conversation. Right here.
Hi, Rachel Oswald. I'm a journalist and not an Asia area expert, so I want to preface that. It seems to me, and again, with my limited knowledge, that those corners of Japan that do seek to minimize World War II atrocities, I'm thinking specifically of the invasion and occupation of Nanking, where the Chinese were the primary victims, and the military sex slavery issue, where Koreans were the primary victims, that's where that is happening. But atrocities committed primarily against Europeans living in Asia and American troops, that there is not an emphasis to walk back or minimize, actions done. Does anybody on the panel have any insight onto why that is, or am I completely off base? And if so, why?
My gut reaction is because we lost.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really the immediate
probably,
response. I don't have any more
it's in
insight.
part sort of a national psychology examination probably that gets you a good answer for it. But so I don't have any good answer, but it's just totally different circumstance in a way. One, I think, because of the outcome of the war. The other are some of the points that Scott got to about the different ways that we perceive history. Americans may err on the side of forgetting history and not knowing much about history in the general population, but on the other hand, we also don't make a fetish of history. So I don't know. That's the best answer I could offer.
Disallow anything, and American POWs are quite upset, actually.
Well, okay. Well, let's leave it there. Let's leave it. Larry.
Larry Nix from CSIS. This is to Dr. Lee. South Korean officials have been, across the board, negative in their comments about the recent Japanese investigative commission that looked back into the formulation of the Kono statement, how it was researched and how it was formulated. Now, the report of the commission did reveal some South Korean involvement in discussions with the Japanese government about the language of the Kono statement. And I can understand some unhappiness on the part of South Koreans about that. But on the other hand, it seems to me that any South Korean official who believed that South Korea's involvement in those years on that issue would have been kept secret forever. Frankly, such officials were pretty naive to believe that this would have been kept secret forever. But my question is, how do you contrast the total South Korean negativity about this investigative commission report with the fact that the commission's report and the statements by the chairman of the commission upheld the Kono statement? They said that the statement was credible, historically accurate, that the research that was done was credible, and that it was based on much deeper research than just the testimony of 16 former South Korean comfort women. So, with the upholding of the Kono statement, which Cabinet Secretary Suga has also testified to, and the Foreign Ministry of Japan has testified to, is the total negativity of the South Korean government regarding this commission really justified, as we have seen it so far?
That's a good question.
I don't speak for the South Korean government. I
But please give your opinion about it.
sometimes don't even speak for myself, but I can say I actually am sympathetic to the negativity coming out of Seoul on the necessity of the review of the Keynote statement. Why was it necessary to revisit this issue, thereby raising questions? And although, as you clearly laid out, the official re-examination did not deny or rescind any substantive part of the Keynote statement made in 1993, the chairman of this government-mandated commission in interviews did say some dubious and arguably offensive things. He stated the obvious, which was academic at best, that the review was based on the testimonials of, I think, 18. You mentioned 16. I may be wrong, but fewer than 20 comfort women many decades after the fact, so they may not have remembered their past clearly. Obviously, that may be true, but it's unnecessary and provocative to say such things, as it is to say there were Korean collaborators, Chinese collaborators in the recruitment of the comfort women. Yes, that's a fact, but that does not negate the simple, essential fact that the Japanese government operated a systematic military institution of brothels. So although the statement or the review of the statement does not deny anything that the Keynote statement explicitly stated, it calls into question the necessity of doing this and the timing of it as well. As we all know, in the past, Prime Minister Abe, as a candidate in 2012, raised issues about the nature of coercion and the credibility of the South Korean charges on the comfort women issue. With respect to the naivete, possibly, of South Korean officials, I fully agree with you. For South Korean officials to have assumed that this would be sealed under lids forever would have been naive. I would also say that to assume that South Korea had no role in this and that the Japanese government in 1993, in the early 90s, based on full contrition and their own initiative, came up with this apology and made that apology without having consulted South Korean officials, also would call into question the basic responsibility of South Korean officials to be engaged in such mutual discussions. So there's some irony there as well, I would say. I think what the South Korean media and the government saw particularly offensive about the latest review is that there were statements made by Japanese officials on alluding to, more than alluding, clearly implying that there was give and take, that the apology in the early 90s was the product of diplomatic concessions made by Japan to South Korea, and not a clear objective analysis study. And I think South Koreans took umbrage to such a characterization.
That's not what the chairman of the commission said.
Right.
He said just the opposite.
Right.
That the South Korean role did not change the basic conclusions of the research.
Yes, but having said that, also raises some implications. It implies that that denial may be within the realm of the possible.
Okay, thank you. Let me, Mindy, if I don't give her a chance to speak, she's going to speak anyway. So what? No, that's okay. Take the microphone. Tell us your thoughts.
Very quick question for Professor Lee. Why are these history issues discussed purely in terms of history as opposed to more of a legalistic international law aspect, in the sense that the Keynote statement was never a cabinet decision? And in fact, in 2007, the Abe government made a cabinet decision, which is a binding legal governmental decision, saying that the Keynote statement was not an official apology and that the women were not coerced. In other words, changing the Keynote statement. So the Keynote statement has never been an unequivocal apology. So why is that not discussed? And we always discuss how many women this happened or not happened, how many whatever. Why is it historical instead of legalistic?
Because this is a historical issue, as I tried to articulate, but was unfortunately a bit incoherent in my presentation, an issue that really defies resolution based on legal grounds alone. Now, the Japanese government has the right, and there's rationality even in the Japanese position of hiding behind the wall of the 1965 Normalization Treaty. At the same time, without moral considerations, to seek, to use that quintessential American concept, closure to this very emotional issue based on legality alone, a treaty alone, devoid of moral considerations, I think is unacceptable to the South Korean public at large. Actually, in South Korea, the biggest historical issues, according to various surveys, is Tokyo, Takeshima in Japan. In my view, it is not in South Korea's interest to publicize this issue because South Korea has de facto administrative control over those islands. It should be a non-issue. But that grabs South Korea's attention, whereas largely South Koreans remain apathetic to ongoing atrocities, arguably much more severe on a bigger scale in North Korea. They remain fixated on the atrocities of the past because Tokyo, again, is a symbol of national humiliation, Japan's direct and brutal occupation of Korea for over a generation. But the comfort women issue is, in my view, the more contentious issue, and I believe even after the surviving 54 or so former comfort women pass on, the sense of humiliation will remain palpable without a clear ritual of repentance, public repentance by the Japanese government.
Yuki, did you want to?
Yeah, let me just say, I think this is whether the Chief Cabinet Secretary statement, how official it is. Of course, it is official. You and I can debate forever about it. If you study Japan enough about government announcement, cabinet decision, and Chief Cabinet Secretary statement and Prime Minister's statement reflects Japanese government official position. And if you are not happy with 1993 Kono statement, you have a 1995 Murayama statement, Prime Minister Murayama statement to look up to, and then I'll leave it at that.
Great. Let's take one more here.
Steve Winters again. I guess I'll address this to Yuki Tatsumi, but if Mr. Lee may want to comment. I know there's, this is the issue of the revised interpretation of the Constitution, which has been put forward by the Abe government. As you know, even within Japan, there's a lot of criticism, and the thing is, it's tied into the historical issues because the question is, some people in Korea and so forth and so on see this somehow as turning away from the pacifist commitment of Japan not to return to a militarist past. So the question is, despite all the statements we heard today about common values, democracy, and so forth and so on, the way the Constitution has been reinterpreted, in effect revised in Japan, has not followed democratic procedures in Japan. It didn't follow the way for revising the Constitution. In fact, Abe couldn't even revise the way the Constitution was revised. It ended up being reinterpreted, in effect revised by a committee appointed by Abe of people who he knew would say, okay, you can reinterpret it, but it's totally out of context. So this is very worrisome to people in China and Korea. And the question is, if it doesn't follow democratic values, then where does the whole argument that we're countries based on democratic processes? Could you comment on that and the Korean concerns about this?
I think the right of collective self-defense issue is actually still politically divisive issue in Japan. So yes, cabinet decision to allow legal changes to reinterpret the current standing interpretation of the Article 9 is announced, but what type of changes does that mean is all needs to be legislated into law, and that debate for that won't even start until next April. And why is that? I do think that it is clear preference of Abe's government to start this right away, frankly. But I think the process was, even if you ask some of the people who feel that these changes are necessary, there are some short circuit that has been done. So Prime Minister Abe came up with this advisory commission's report on mid-May. And in the press statement, he clearly says, I'm not in a hurry to do this. I'll seek dialogue with people. And long and behold, he just decided to do it in a cabinet decision within a month. So that made it actually even more politically divisive for the government to handle this. So on one hand, if you see that from outside of Japan, where you actually, only thing you see is sporadic reporting of how this is done. And if you recall, a couple of days before the cabinet decision, there was a large protest in front of Prime Minister's office. I have not, that was over the security issue. That's not something that I have seen for a while, quite frankly. So I do see where the concerns might be coming from and why. But at the same time, I also do think that the changes that ends up happening is very limited and very restrained. It will be restrained in a sense that it probably is too restrained for some in this country to see coming from Japan. As I think there are going to be more discussion about that on the next panel, because I think this is more about.
I wanted to just get a last question here with Scott, and that Yuki outlined all of the overtures made during the DPJ administration, the three prime ministers. Did Korea blow it in those years? Was there a real opportunity to move the relationship forward in a way that could be sustained over the long run, and it missed the opportunity for political or other reasons?
I do believe that several of those initiatives were missed opportunities on the part of the Koreans. It probably also does reflect that the debate in Korea is not ripe enough to be able to come to that point of view. But I think that now the situation is one where, under the Abe government, some in Korea say, well, we can't move forward. But then you look back at the DPJ period and you see those opportunities. And I think it damages the Korean position to a certain extent, not having reciprocated some of those gestures.
Great, thank you. Well, we're going to have to leave it there, bring up the next panel. Thank you very much, you all, for a very enlightening conversation. Okay, why don't we get started? Get started with this third discussion here, so I can recognize Chris Nelson before he has a chance for a bathroom break.
It's good to see you. I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to go through same sort of drill here as the last panel. I'll introduce everyone, and then have them go through one at a time, give 10, 15 minutes with remarks, and then have a conversation. Incidentally, I have no idea why it's so darn cold in here. If you haven't noticed, you're very, very cold-blooded. But let me start by introducing Dr. Victor Cha. Victor is Senior Advisor and Korea Chair at CSIS. He's also Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown University and holds the D.S. Song Chair in the Department of Government and School of Foreign Service there. Victor is also a former Director for Asian Affairs at on the NSC staff during the Bush administration. There are actually a couple other titles I'm leaving out there, but there's so many of them and they've exhausted me. But I should also mention your most recent book, The Impossible State, North Korea, Past and Future. We had a discussion here of that a couple of years ago, and when it came out, we were glad to do so. So look forward to your remarks, Victor. Evans Revere. Evans is Senior Advisor at Albright Stonebridge Group and former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. He was also president and CEO of the Korea Society and DCM at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul. We've been looking for an opportunity to get Evans here for some time. Finally, things worked out, and he's here, so we're very, very pleased to have him. Welcome. And then Bruce Klingner will bat cleanup, which is his normal role in the lineup here at Heritage. Bruce is senior research fellow for Northeast Asia, and he's very well known on all these issues, and I'm sure most of you know him here. He's known largely as a Korea hand, but I assure you he provokes reaction from both sides. And that's how we know he's doing a decent job, because he's making everyone angry. Before Heritage, joining Heritage in 2007, Bruce spent 20 years with the CIA and DIA, including stints as chief of the CIA's Korea branch and deputy division chief for Korea. So with that, let me turn it over to Victor and get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. It's a pleasure to be here at Heritage, and I do want to thank Heritage for the time that you allowed me to talk about my book when it came out a year or two ago. So it's great to be here. I don't actually notice the cold because I just came running over from the other side of town. It feels actually quite refreshing here right now. I'm going to make my comments brief and really focus them on this question of why and under what conditions these difficult historical issues have impeded cooperation between Japan and Korea. I'm not really going to get into a discussion of defending one government's position or another government's position, or who's right on comfort women or who's right on islands disputes, but really I'm trying to look at this from the perspective of how and why do we have these things impeding strategic cooperation. So I have a couple of points. The first, I think, and again, I do not have the benefit of the discussion this afternoon, so forgive me if I'm repeating some things that have already been said. I'm pretty sure that I am repeating some things that have already been said. But the first point that I would make is that the issue of history and its ability to sort of impede or bubble up and impact political relations is really nothing new. We have seen the ebb and flow of Seoul-Tokyo relations in the 1960s, during normalization, in the early 1970s, during the Kim Dae-jung kidnapping or the assassination attempt by Moon Se-kwang on Park Chung-hee, in the 80s as well. We've seen it happen over and over again. And, at the risk of overgeneralization, I think I would say that, and the way this reaction has typically been characterized has been a great deal of emotion and anger on the Korean side, and what essentially is indifference on the Japanese side. Not the same level of emotion and anger, but really just indifference. And we know all the issues, whether it's textbooks, statements by education ministers, Yasukuni, we know all the sorts of issues that have created this. But there was always a cycle to it. Whenever we came to a textbook revision or whenever we came to a shrine visit, there was almost a pattern to the cycle in which you'd have protests, a momentary disruption, some more anger, but eventually a return to normalcy of one form or another. So, there's a pattern of interaction over this that we have seen over time. That's the first point. Second point is that today, though, it's a little bit different. And I think it's different in three ways. The first is that, again, at the risk of overgeneralization, in the past we've seen these sorts of disputes arise, and they followed a cycle. But arguably what's different today than from the past cycles is that the current cycles are about efforts to change the status quo on these history issues. I mean, these history issues, again, have always been there. But what seems different this time is that we're really talking about actions, intentionally or unintentionally, that are aimed at trying to change the status quo. So, for example, when the previous South Korean president, Lee Myung-bak, MB Lee, made the decision to visit those two little rocks, right? Liankor, Tokdo, Takeshima, whatever you want to call them. When he made the decision to visit those rocks, that was changing the status quo. That was not just provoking the Japanese to come up with a reaction that would also change the status quo on their side, but also setting a precedent for future South Korean presidents where they will feel at one point or another in their term in office pressure to do the same thing. So that was something that really that really did change the status quo and led to a reaction by Japan that was beyond something we've seen before. So this immediately escalates the situation. When there was talk about, prior to the review that was undertaken, when there was talk, intimation, suggestions that Prime Minister Abe would reinterpret the Kono statement, that again is a case where there's a potential to change the status quo. And that, I think, leads to much deeper spirals in terms of the relationship. During the George W. Bush administration, this was after I had left office, but something my successor had to deal with when we had the whole sort of crisis over the BGN naming of the rocks. In the end, that was, again, something that created a great deal of consternation in South Korea, even led President Lee to position himself in meeting President Bush in an ancient Korean map, and precisely had him stand right at the point where Tokdo Takeshima was, so that he could point to it to President Bush and say, oh, these belong to Korea. And if you haven't read, there's a very good piece by Katrin Katz, in Foreign Policy, in which she was the NSC staffer who was in there at the time of all this, that recounts all of this, and it's a fascinating piece. But in the end, the decision was simply to return it to the status quo, right? To go back to where it was before, because we don't know how else to resolve these issues except to try to maintain the status quo. So I think that's something that's different today, is that the things that we're seeing are really angling more towards changing the status quo than not. Secondly, quite obviously, that's why we have this panel. These issues have come to the level where they have been an impediment to pragmatic and strategic cooperation, whether you're talking about military services and parts agreements, or military information sharing, or the FTA, or currency swap agreements, or meetings between leaders, summit meetings. All of this has been held hostage to this particular cycle of very bad historical problems. And then the third difference, I think, these days is, and this is my own view, I don't know if everybody in the room shares this view, is that earlier I mentioned that what we see is generally Korean emotionalism and anger and Japanese indifference. And I think what's different today is that you still have the same Korean emotionalism and anger, right? But what's different is the shift on the Japanese side, particularly among, I would say, among even Korea friends in the bureaucracy, but certainly in the media and the politicians, a real shift to say it's so-called Korea fatigue, this notion that they're just tired of it, right? They're tired of the constant harping and complaining. They don't want to deal with it anymore, and it really has swung, I think, quite a bit in Japan now in a way that we haven't seen in the past. Third point is that the historical issues are obviously bad for Seoul-Tokyo cooperation, but they're also, they have ripple effects clearly throughout the region. For one, they certainly complicate U.S. Japan-Korea military and strategic cooperation for all the reasons we're very well aware of. Whether you're talking about dealing with North Korean boats or North Korean missiles or any of these sorts of things, the inability to be able to share information seamlessly, or to be able to, for the United States to be able to operate seamlessly between our two alliances, certainly makes it much harder, much more complicated for the United States. And at a political level, really impedes or poses or stains, if you will, the so-called pivot or rebalance to Asia. The notion that we are doing this, but at the same time, our allies are completely dysfunctional in terms of their relationship with one another really begs the question of how successful the pivot is. And then, of course, these sorts of things, these sorts of difficulties only serve to embolden others in the region, North Korea, of course, but also China, in the sense that if one of the things that China very clearly wants to do is to delegitimize and to complicate the U.S. bilateral alliance structure in Asia, having this very dysfunctional spat between our two key allies in Asia is, of course, something that's quite welcome. And that makes it easier for China to put forward this effort to try to delegitimize. What I mean is, they're not trying. It's not a question of trying to compete militarily with the United States in Asia, but to sort of delegitimize the notion that these alliances are a core element and the legitimate leadership element of the architecture in Asia. Right? That's something the Chinese would clearly like the region not to believe in anymore, and so Japan-Korea dysfunction, U.S. Japan-Korea dysfunction only serves that purpose. Recommendations. So first, on history, I wrote quite a bit on this. My first book as an academic was on U.S. Japan-Korea and the difficult historical issues and strategic cooperation. I believe there's no solution to these sorts of history issues. I mean, you have the negotiations over comfort women, and you have these efforts to for the Prime Minister not to go to Yasukuni Shrine, but I don't think we're going to ever see a solution to these sorts of issues, even if there is some sort of agreement that is reached on comfort women during Prime Minister Abe's term in office. Even if there is some agreement on a women's fund and a formula for the Chief Cabinet Secretary and the Ambassador to meet with some of the survivors and a statement of regret, even if you get all of those things, I don't think it's going to resolve the issue, because I think many still believe that Prime Minister Abe does not believe it, right? He does not believe that that the Japanese government was complicit in the recruitment and running of these sorts of operations. So even if there is an agreement that's reached, I don't think it's going to solve the issue. Having said that, obviously you need the negotiations to continue. No one's saying that they shouldn't continue. But in terms of so-called, somebody mentioned the word closure on the last panel, I don't think we're going to get closure on this. So, so the issue is not whether we can find a solution, but how we manage to forge some degree of pragmatic cooperation, accepting that these difficult historical issues are going to be a baseline, constitute the baseline of the relationships, particularly between Japan and Korea in Asia. How do we forge cooperation in spite of this baseline? How do we return to a degree of normalcy? And so I would just make three very quick suggestions. The first, and these are very specific suggestions, the first is that I think the South Koreans should be willing to have a meeting with Prime Minister Abe on the sidelines of UNGA in New York. Even if there is no agreement or solution on comfort women, you should not hold hostage, right, summit-level discussions. You should not hold that hostage to a director general level negotiation. Right? I just don't think it's good politics. It's not good diplomacy, and I think there are signs. There's some positive signs. I mean, President Park met with was it the mayor of Tokyo, when the mayor of Tokyo visited the Seoul mayor. So I think there are positive signs there. So I think take the upper road, take the higher road, upper road, and do that meeting. For Japan, I think there really has to be an effort to start turning around public opinion in Japan. I really feel like it's swung completely in a different direction, one that's quite antagonistic towards Korea right now. My friends in the Japanese government who are good friends of Korea admit this, that it's difficult to make the argument, but they've got to sort of figure out how to turn around this Korea fatigue that we see and Korea bashing in the press and among the politicians. And then for the United States, I think very clearly this is a very difficult issue for the United States. They've been dealing it for a long time with Korea in terms of trying to get Korea to cooperate more with Japan. And when it comes to the issues of collective self-defense and these other things, I know no U.S. official will say this publicly, but essentially I think the United States, in effect, through its actions, its non-actions, its whispers, its side statements, are essentially saying, we support Japan and the reinterpretation of the right of collective self-defense, but we don't support a reinterpretation of the Kono Statement or anything that has to do with, in some fashion, whitewashing the comfort women issue. I think, again, it's not stated U.S. policy, but I basically think that's where the United States is. And then it's, I think, incumbent on both the United States and Korea to make the case to Japan that Abe's efforts to really grow Japanese leadership in the region and the world are good things. For a long time, the region, the country has wanted a more dynamic and proactive prime minister with an agenda, an economic and security agenda that's much more proactive, but also impress upon the point that that sort of leadership is not just about money and it's not just about power. It's about legitimacy, right? You got to be seen as legitimate, and as long as issues like comfort women remain such a difficult issue for the government to discuss and to deal with, it's going to undercut all of these other efforts at building sort of legitimate leadership on the security side as well as on the economic side.
Evans, at your leisure, pleasure.
Thank you. Let me begin by commending the Heritage Foundation for organizing a really special set of comments and conversations today. This has been extremely valuable. And also thank you for bringing together such a fine group of personal friends and colleagues of mine. I think I've worked with every member of both panels and both of our keynote speakers today over many years. And so it's a special pleasure for me. And thank you for bringing me down from the wilds of New Jersey to be here today. Just a little bit of background about me that may not have come out in the introduction, the very kind introduction, and that is I spent most of my Foreign Service career dealing with Korea and Japan, including many years learning both languages, devoted many years of my life to seeking to strengthen U.S. relations with both those allied countries. And during my diplomatic career, I had the very distinct privilege of serving as country director at the State Department for both Japan and Korea, including a time that I would now characterize as being the high tide of our trilateral cooperation on North Korea and some other issues. And so it's a special honor to be able to participate in this discussion today. This panel has been asked to address the implications of this downturn in Korea-Japan relations for the United States and for trilateral security cooperation. And Victor has just launched us into a very good discussion of that. And I'll try to add some additional thoughts. But in doing so, let me just at the outset provide you with my own assessment of the current state of Korea-Japan relations to the ones that you've already heard. And I don't think it'll surprise anyone if I echo some of the comments that have been made that suggest that this relationship is deeply problem-plagued, often dysfunctional, and in my view, the worst shape that I've seen it in many years. It is deeply and personally disappointing for me to say that, having spent as much time as I've spent working to improve our ties with both countries. It occurs to me that if Korea and Japan were two countries on different continents or were separated by thousands of miles or facing very different security threats, a problematic political and diplomatic relationship between the two might not be so important. But they are none of those things. They are neighbors facing a range of common challenges and dangers, and the fact that they find themselves at loggerheads more often than not these days and find themselves unable to establish the sort of relationship that would be in both their interests and that we know they are capable of forging is both regrettable and a cause for concern. Particularly to their only treaty ally, the United States of America. The U.S., to say the obvious, has a major stake in preserving peace and stability in Northeast Asia and close trilateral cooperation with Tokyo and Seoul. And America has a similar stake in ensuring that the ROK and Japan forge the closest possible links to meet their common threats, which are also, of course, threats to core U.S. interests in the region. It isn't my purpose today to chart the origins of the troubled ties that exist between Seoul and Tokyo. Others have already done that today. But it is my job to talk about their impact on the United States and its strategic objectives in the region, so let me be very frank with you. The current difficulties between Tokyo and Seoul undermine long-standing U.S. efforts to create a trilateral partnership aimed at dealing with both the current and emerging security threats in the region. In one critically important area, trilateral cooperation to deal with North Korea, that cooperation is not what it was and is not what it should be. Problematic ROK-Japan ties have allowed suspicions to arise in Seoul about Japan's current approach to dealing with North Korea, and Pyongyang, seeing an advantage created by the rift between Tokyo and Seoul, seems eager to leverage that gap and perhaps deepen the divide between Tokyo and Seoul. The complicated Japan-ROK relationship is also being eyed very carefully by China, which, as others have suggested here, probably sees an advantage to be gained from current Korea-Japan tensions. The PRC has made very clear in recent months that it regards the U.S.-centered alliance system in the Asia-Pacific region as an anachronism and is no longer relevant to the region's current security concerns. Some Chinese officials have even suggested that a China-centric security system based on an Asia for the Asians approach should replace the network of U.S. alliances in the region. Leaders in Tokyo and Seoul should reflect very carefully on whether their inability to deal more effectively with the issues between them may be creating a tactical or strategic opening for a Beijing that has developed an evident allergy to a U.S.-led regional security architecture. I would also suggest that current difficulties in Korea-Japan relations undermine a core U.S. interest in maintaining stability in the region through these very alliances that I've mentioned, just as they detract from the effectiveness of the deterrence that could and should be provided by a more harmonious and cooperative U.S.-Japan-Korea triangular relationship. And this, I would argue, sends the wrong message to North Korea. And as I've suggested, I think it also sends the wrong message to Beijing. Nevertheless, there is a bit of good news in ROK-Japan security relations in that both sides have often managed over the last several years to insulate some elements of their routine security dialogue and cooperation from the most divisive aspects of Japan-ROK relations. And the two sides have also managed to keep much of their ongoing security cooperation under the radar, and that's a good thing. But the bad news is that ROK-Japan security cooperation remains subject to the vagaries of the two countries' diplomatic and political relations and to the public mood swings and media hype and mutual recrimination that has come to characterize bilateral atmospherics to an uncomfortable degree. Thus, we have witnessed how reasonable and important bilateral initiatives, such as the now defunct GSOMIA, the Military Information Secrecy Agreement, were torpedoed because of the downturn in bilateral ties. And we've seen how straightforward, commonsensical cooperation, for example, in sharing ammunition in a peacekeeping operation in South Sudan, became impossible because of the negative dynamics in Japan-ROK relations. Discussions of critically important mutual support and cooperation in future Korean Peninsula contingencies are hampered or even barred because of the current atmospherics between the two. the valuable support that Japan could provide the United States in a regional contingency as a result of its revised policy on collective self-defense is today, oddly, and I would say wrongly portrayed by some as somehow threatening Korean security. And even the normal business of diplomacy, such as leadership-level summitry, which can serve as an important component of sending a strong deterrent message to potential adversaries, even that has proved impossible to date because of the deterioration in bilateral ties. And we witnessed an unhelpful and useless, in my view, debate over the issue of whether consultations might be needed before U.S. forces and facilities in Japan would be able to help in a Korean Peninsula contingency. You'll pardon me if I come away from that assessment of that incident with the impression that Kim Jong-il has some reason to be smiling in Pyongyang today. Nevertheless, I am encouraged by signs that there is growing realization in Seoul and Tokyo that things have gone far enough and that it's time for renewed efforts to reinvigorate bilateral dialogue and trilateral coordination. The meeting between foreign ministers on the margins of the recent ASEAN ministerial was encouraging. So was the recent U.S. ROK Japan defense trilateral here in Washington. And earlier, Director General level dialogue on North Korea was also a welcome sign that these two neighbors understand the importance of ensuring that they stay on the same page vis-a-vis North Korea. The trilateral military dialogue by defense chiefs that took place on the margins of the RIMPAC exercise in the Pacific was also valuable, as were the Japanese assurances that were provided to Korea in that dialogue about the scope and limitations of Japan's new collective self-defense doctrine. More such dialogue, including bilaterally at the ministerial level, would be extremely valuable, particularly in enhancing transparency and resolving any lingering questions and concerns that Seoul may have about Japanese defense planning. It goes without saying that such dialogue is also important because we are on the cusp of a qualitative change in the nature of the threat posed by North Korea. The need to refine and enhance our deterrence of Pyongyang is going to be a major task in the coming months and years, and that task is going to require new levels of bilateral and trilateral security cooperation between and among us. The North Korean threat is evolving in a dangerous new direction, and in the not too distant future, the North's perfection of deliverable nuclear weapons and the missiles with which to deliver those weapons is going to alter regional security dynamics in troubling ways. Besides raising the prospect that the North might use or threaten to use these weapons, Pyongyang's development of this capability is going to increase the potential for proliferation. It's going to raise questions about the validity and effectiveness of the U.S. extended deterrent and our commitment to defend our allies. And it might even spur a debate in Korea and Japan about the need for their own nuclear deterrent. Such prospects, however realistic or remote, argue strongly in favor of a renewed bilateral and trilateral dialogue about the nature of this new threat and about the efficacy and credibility of the U.S. deterrent and defense commitments. And I have every reason to believe that the United States will want to have just such a dialogue. And as we look to the future, the other main challenge we face will emanate from China. A wealthier, stronger China is channeling growing resources into its military towards uncertain ends. And Beijing is also making clear that the days when it followed Deng Xiaoping's maxim to hide one's strength and bide one's time are over. And so a more assertive posture by the PRC on territorial issues seems unlikely to go away anytime soon, and this has important implications for all of us, especially if the PRC does not respond well to our collective and individual efforts to forge a more cooperative and transparent relationship with China. But having said that, let me be clear, the task of building better ties with China remains an important one, and that task is a lot more easily accomplished if Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul are all on the same page. Let me also suggest that as Beijing begins to raise, as Victor mentioned a moment ago, serious questions about the validity of the U.S.-based alliance system, Japan and the ROK have long shared and supported the U.S. vision of the importance of that alliance system and have welcomed the central role that the U.S. has played over the decades. And for the United States to continue to play that role in the face of a China that now questions it, the closest possible cooperation and coordination with our Korean and Japanese allies is going to be essential. Going forward, it's also going to be critically important to Japan and Korea, to the United States, and to the region that Seoul and Tokyo refurbish and rehabilitate their frayed partnership. Korea and Japan can't erase their history, they can't change it, they cannot and should not forget that history, but they can decide that they are not destined forever to be prisoners of that history. We've had several famous historians quoted already here today. Let me cite a not-so-famous one, me, by saying that those who dwell solely on the past are condemned to stay there. Japan and the ROK certainly have the capacity to manage the legacy of their troubled past and dedicate themselves to building a new type of relationship in this century that reflects their common concerns and challenges. In her Liberation Day speech on August 15th, ROK President Park Geun-hye seemed to hold out hope that just such an approach might be possible. In her remarks, she reminded us, as we've already heard, that next year is the 50th anniversary of the normalization of Korea-Japan relations, and she called on both sides to set our sights on the next 50 years and start making progress towards future-oriented, friendly cooperative relations between the ROK and Japan. And next year will also be the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, of the liberation of Korea, and of the beginning of a dramatic process that saw Japan eventually become a country dedicated to democracy and peace. With these auspicious anniversaries on the horizon, could there possibly be a better way for the two countries to mark the occasion next year on August 15th, 2015, than by issuing a joint statement of principles that would describe a new type of Japan-ROK relationship? Would it be possible for Seoul and Tokyo to agree in the coming weeks to establish a bilateral forum aimed at developing a cooperative agenda that could be addressed over the next year, so that leaders in Tokyo and Seoul could announce what they had accomplished in a year's time? I have in mind a series of symbolic steps, practical progress on delicate issues, you know what they are, and public events that would form the basis for real progress between the two. And in concluding, let me also ask whether it's possible that Japan's Prime Minister and Korea's President could use their speeches on August 15th next year to convey a shared agenda for future bilateral cooperation. The late President Kim Dae-jung and late Prime Minister Obuchi made a good start at doing just that in 1998. It's time to try this again. A turnabout in ties may not be easy to achieve, but neither does it seem totally impossible. And if the two sides can launch the sort of future-oriented relationship called for by President Park, it will mark a dramatic and far-reaching contribution to peace and stability. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you.
Bruce? Yeah, I would like to think of myself, as Walter described me, as the great cleanup batter, and that all those who preceded me today, their mission was simply to get on base, and I would bring them home with a mighty swing of my analysis. I think instead I'm probably like the little guy at the end of the parade saying, okay, that's it. Hope you had a good time. Nothing else to see. No, not the janitor. Anyway, I would say, as we've obviously focused on historic issues, but the U.S. looks at Asia not so much from a historic view, but from a security point of view. And as such, we see our national interests and also the threats to them. And the most obvious threats to the U.S. and to our friends right now are from North Korea and China. And North Korea is the most immediately pernicious threat, including the growing threat from its nuclear and missile programs, as well as military attacks on South Korea. And if North Korea is the wolf closest to the sled, then China is seen as the 800-pound dragon, which is emerging from the shadows. Now, some of the implications of this focus on the historic issues have been really taking our eyes off the ball of these very real threats in Asia. Now, both North Korea and China also share another characteristic in that both of them also have an incorrect view of history, and particularly their role in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of South Koreans during 1950 to 1953. And during his visit to Seoul, President Xi Jinping, as has been mentioned before, he cited the Imjin War as a symbol of Chinese and South Korean sharing interests and defenses against a common threat. But he conveniently glossed over the more recent role of China in the 1950 to 53 Korean War. Now, nor has China or North Korea ever apologized, with sincerity or otherwise, to South Korea for their actions during the war, nor any subsequent incident. North Korea has not apologized for its repeated attempts to kill the South Korean president, for blowing up a civilian airliner, and the list goes on. And nor has it apologized or even ceased its relentless propaganda against the South, including calling President Park Geun-hye a comfort woman and many other heinous statements. And China, which is currently engaged right now in a charm offensive towards South Korea to wean it away from the U.S. and Japan, has also worked against South Korean national interests by repeatedly impeding any meaningful international response to North Korea's 2 acts of war against South Korea in 2010, as well as all the repeated violations of the UN Security Council resolutions. And yet, despite China's incorrect historical viewpoint and lack of contrition, Seoul hasn't refused to hold summits with Beijing as it has refused to hold summits with Tokyo. Now, beyond those very obvious direct threats to the U.S. and its friends in Asia, there is, unfortunately, the more subtle threat that we've been talking about throughout the day, that from the strained relations of our 2 very close friends and critical partners in Northeast Asia, the Republic of Korea and Japan. And I mean, let me emphasize and then sort of quickly gloss over the importance of our relationship with both nations for our own interest and for also their interest. And also the fact of the need for very close trilateral cooperation at a time of rising security threats. And unfortunately, right now, that cooperation is having great difficulty, even though Washington's relations with Seoul and Tokyo are perhaps the best they've ever been, but that the strained relations between our allies is preventing further cooperation, as well as sort of splattering the U.S. with accusations of favoritism of one ally over the other. Now, during all of the previous flare-ups between Tokyo and Seoul, and there have been many before the current administrations in Seoul and Tokyo, Washington had sought to remain aloof. There seemed to be no percentage in getting involved in a fight between 2 close friends. But really, the bilateral relations now have become so dire and for such a long time, and there seems really very little hope for reconciliation, that Washington really during the past year has felt a need to become more involved in behind-the-scenes shuttle diplomacy. And that U.S. role has perhaps not always been obvious, but it's included some quite frank messages delivered privately, as it should be, to both our allies. Because indeed, Washington has become frustrated with both our friends. And with Japan for its tin-eared, ham-fisted diplomatic approach toward resolving historic issues, and with South Korea's insistence on seeing every issue through the lens of history and seeming inability at times to take yes for an answer. And Admiral Blair cited George Santayana's famous adage before, of those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I would cite a corollary from another not famous historian, me. I'd suggest a Klinger corollary that those who refuse to atone for the past and those who refuse to forget the past are doomed to endlessly repeat it and put their own future at risk. Now, let's first take a look at Japanese actions during the occupation in World War II. As I stated at an event similar to this last month here at Heritage when we hosted a visiting Japanese parliamentarian, the evidence of Japanese actions and atrocities during 1910 and 1945, it's unequivocal, it's overwhelming. And for anyone in Japan to question those actions or Tokyo's responsibility really is historically inaccurate and morally reprehensible. And it's equally indefensible to seek to minimize the scope of those actions by questioning the number of casualties at Nanking or disputing details of testimony by comfort women. And really, for Americans, it's incomprehensible why Japan would even provide the appearance of seeming to minimize its responsibility, since after all, those actions were undertaken by a Japanese regime that has been irreversibly replaced by a democratic system. And historic issues would not still be issues had Tokyo more forthrightly and repeatedly atoned for its past and denied those who deny those actions. And I think successive Japanese administrations have undermined their own attempts at reconciliation by adopting a minimalistic, legalistic approach. And if Tokyo wants to move beyond the history issues in order to fulfill its own policy objectives and play a more effective regional and even global role, it must make a more concerted, systematic effort to alleviate the neighbors' concerns over historic issues, and to do so by embracing bolder measures. And I would offer 5 recommendations. One would be to establish a reconciliation process to include, as a minimum, official, unequivocal, and repeated affirmations of the Kono and Murayama statements. 2 would be even better than that, would be a new statement, which would be worked out in private consultations with Seoul to more fully embrace responsibility for the past actions, and in return, having Seoul articulate what steps it will take in order to move forward. 3, a mutually agreed upon mechanism for compensating the surviving comfort women. 4, a pledge by the Prime Minister not to revisit Yasukuni. And 5, a condemnation of any future revisionist statements by Japanese politicians, as well as any groups advocating hate speech. Now, for historic issues to become water under the bridge, it requires both Japan and South Korea to make better efforts to build a bridge of reconciliation. And the United States has its own troubled history with Japan. And history is important. But which history? The history of the last century or the history of the last 70 years since the end of World War II? Now, turning to South Korea, I'd say South Koreans discern future Japanese intentions based on Japanese actions during 1910 and 1945, while Americans tend to base their perceptions of Japanese future actions on those actions that Tokyo has undertaken from 1945 to the present day. Now, some perceive and ascribe to the Japanese government secret plans and intentions to resurrect 1930s militarism, and that view has no basis in fact. And it's puzzling to Americans that South Korea seems more worried and more easily worked up by a hypothetical Japanese military threat than the very real threat from North Korea. And when South Korean polls show that Japan is considered to be a security threat second only to North Korea, or indeed in some polls to be a greater military threat than North Korea, Americans really are just perplexed. And we've seen that, I think most recently in the many mischaracterizations of what the Japanese collective self-defense would entail. Now, in the Japanese context, the changes that are being contemplated for collective self-defense, they seem monumental, given really the lethargy of the last several decades, and responding to changes in the security environments. But from a U.S. point of view, it really is still pitifully small. So even if they were to implement all 15 scenarios, it really is disappointingly inadequate of what would need to be done. So for what I would recommend for South Korea would be, 1, to compartmentalize and prioritize its foreign policy, to exercise pragmatic leadership by not allowing emotional nationalism to impede security policies necessary for the defense of Korea. 2 would be to articulate a framework for resolving the contentious issues by defining specific steps and/or language that would enable Seoul and Tokyo to move forward, rather than these continuing amorphous demands for sincerity. 3 would be to offer Tokyo assurance that it will publicly accept Japanese steps toward reconciliation. 4, if preliminary steps are taken, an agreement to have a bilateral summit with Japan. And 5, really, in essence, to adopt a trust politique policy with Japan. When we think of some of the implications of these strained relations, we have things like collective self-defense, and as others have mentioned, the JSOMIA, the Military Intelligence Sharing Agreement. Another one is ballistic missile defense. And right now, South Korea is determined to implement a less effective defense of its own populace than is otherwise possible, otherwise available. And that's both a resistance to deploying better equipment, such as THAAD or SM-6. It really is, they're determined to maintain a final approach defense only. It's like in soccer saying, I only need a goalie. I don't need middies, I don't need defense players. a goalie is fine enough. That last-ditch final defense is enough. And also, Seoul resists implementing or integrating its ballistic missile defense system into the broader, more comprehensive Allied system. And again, to use another sports analogy, it's like having 3 outfielders in baseball who refuse to talk to each other. Anyone who's played baseball knows if your outfielders are talking to each other, telling you to move in, move out, because they have a different perspective on the fly ball that's coming out, you know you're more likely to catch the ball, or in this case, to intercept a missile. And it's uncertain why Seoul continues to resist both those steps. Some think it's because it doesn't want to offend China, that China would interpret this improved defensive system as a threat to China. Well, obviously China is not acting in South Korea's national interest. Others contend that it is because South Korea simply does not want to become involved in a system that also involves Japan. But I'd say in conclusion, I'd repeat that history is important, but we should focus on the proper history and that it must not hold the present or the future hostage. And Tokyo should more effectively address its responsibility for the past. Seoul should remember who its real friend is and who its real ally is and who the real threats are. And the U.S. should take whatever steps are necessary to help our 2 critical partners to achieve reconciliation. Thank you very much.
Well, with that, let me open it up to questions from the floor. Did you have something? Sure. Go ahead. Right here, Chris.
Thanks, Walter. Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Thanks, guys, for a really great discussion. Evans, I love your anniversary recommendations next year. So send that to me electronically so I can get that out there. All during some of the earlier discussions about the South Korean consternation at how the Suga investigation played out in terms of lifting the lid on the consultations, you know, at the time, I kept banging my head, what the hell? If they hadn't consulted, it would have been grotesquely irresponsible. The whole purpose of the Kona statement was to somehow work a reconciliation between South Korea and Japan. So the idea that that becomes a scandal and that becomes a criticism, you know, to me that betrays, in many ways, the heart of the problem that we're trying to resist. And maybe we need to bear that in mind when we're talking about, yeah, next year we got to have these anniversaries and we got to talk to each other. Well, do they even want to talk to each other? Is that going to be further proof of conspiracy? You know, that's something that just to worry about. When I was in Tokyo in, I guess it was late March or April, it blurs after a while, and the Korea fatigue kept coming up, and they all used that phrase in English, not just the Kante guys, but also the Gaimisho guys. But then I went out drinking one night with a bunch of young journalists, and they used the same damn thing. So, boy, it's really there. This isn't just some propaganda thing. It's really there, and it's a big problem. But in talking especially to, I guess this would have been the Kante guys. I said, hey, wait a minute. You're Todai, right? Tokyo University, yeah. Law faculty, right? Yeah, every damn one of them's a lawyer. And you end up saying, now, wait a minute, guys. You're foreign ministry. You're supposed to be talking about diplomacy and relationships. But there's this thing about the law and the treaties that always gets in the way of what we're really talking about here, which is public relations. You know, corporate image, national image, these kind of feelings. So again, that's another way to sort of to think about the approach. What are we trying to do here? You're trying to improve Japan's brand, you know, with the South Koreans, and vice versa, because the Japanese are tired and they don't believe them anymore, and the Gulf. So maybe we need to bring some actual good old Washington PR thinking to this, as horrible as I thought may be. So it's not.
That is a horrible thought.
It is. I know, it's depressing. Anyway, comments more than questions, but I had to get.
But no, anyone have?
Thank you for indulging me.
I think we've been largely talking to the same group of people in Tokyo, but let me also suggest to you that I think there are many, many people in Japan, including many in the foreign ministry, who probably have a very similar take and complaint as the one that you've just uttered. And yes, there has been an excessive reliance on a legalistic approach on something as delicate as the comfort woman issue. some might say with good reason, because it's based on the normalization agreement between the ROK and Japan. Okay, there was a legal framework established in that dialogue that led to the normalization process, and that Japan is adhering to that interpretation, and this issue is closed, et cetera, et cetera. You know the argument. But as I've been arguing with my Japanese friends, it may be time to lock the lawyers up in a room somewhere and deal with this as an issue of moral responsibility, as an issue of historical closure, if you will, as an issue of Japan's image in the world. When so many countries that are very, very enamored of Japan around the world have been piling on in their criticisms about Japan's management of the comfort woman issue, the message to Tokyo should be clear, that legalisms aside, however accurate they may be, this issue has metastasized in a way that is undermining Japan's moral authority, of which it has prided itself in the 70 years, 69 years since the end of World War II. And so I think one important takeaway from your comments just now is perhaps for senior level Japanese to internalize that and to figure out a way to set aside, if you will, legalisms and deal with this from a broader historical and moral perspective. That's my 2 cents.
I just add is, yeah, I think on the Kona review, I think in a way that really is a microcosm of a lot of the historic problems, in that when a Diet member raised questions about the Kona statement, the administration should have simply said, we're not doing a review. It's government policy, we have crates worth of evidence which led us to issue the statement. Enough said, we're not going to do a review. Having then gone down the path of doing the review, they had sort of another lost opportunity when they presented it, is really the most important comment from the review was Cabinet Secretary Suga affirming the Kona statement. That should have been the message which was repeated over and over, and even beyond that saying, well, let's take the opportunity to even more fully embrace responsibility in order to put this issue behind us. So another lost opportunity. And also I think it did reflect the South Korean suspicion of anything Japan does now. Yeah, I agree. South Korea should have declared victory. It should have said, Suga affirmed the statement, as Abe did in March, and the Murayama statement before that. The report showed that even before the Japanese government interviewed the comfort women, from their own available holdings of evidence, they were going to, as they told a South Korean diplomat, they were going to issue the Kona statement, sort of victory number 2. And victory number 3 would be that that Japan responded to South Korean requests or demands for specific words, specific actions. That's what diplomats should do. And that's actually, I think, a model for what should be done now, is quietly Seoul saying what it would like, Tokyo saying what it might be able to do, a bit of give and take, so that then you have a Japanese announcement and a South Korean acceptance of it. So I think as they shouldn't have done the review, but they did lose opportunities really on both sides to kind of put the issue behind them.
Do you have anything?
On the Kona statement review, yeah, I mean, I kind of had the same feeling when I was in Seoul, and there was a lot of hand-wringing about what would come out about the consultations, and it just reaffirmed to me how bad things are. You think, so another famous historian, not so famous historian, once said, things are bad when the solution becomes the problem, right? And that's really what it was in that case. On the Korea fatigue in Japan, I think what's interesting is that actually in Seoul these days, there's a little bit more pragmatism. There's sort of like, yes, we've got this DG dialogue going on. We have to see how that turns out. But the Hwang Jung-guk went to Tokyo, right, for trilateral court. We're doing SAREX exercises. There's sort of a tone that on the Korean side actually where they're trying to say we can compartmentalize the history issue with Japan as we pursue pragmatic cooperation. Now, where does that come from? I don't think that comes from some sort of Korean realization that they're being unreasonable. It's largely a bank shot from the Korea-China summit, right? Because after Park Geun-hye met with Xi Jinping, everybody's worried that Korea's falling into China's orbit. They're falling into China's lap. So I think in many ways it's a reaction to that. Now, when you do policy, right? I mean, you just try to, you do your best you can to make lemonade out of lemons, right? And so there's a lemon, right? Korea falling into China's orbit, it creates some antibodies in Seoul. Oh, we've got to show, you know, we're still in with the, so use that, right? Use that to try to promote more Japan-Korea cooperation. So I think the challenge right now from like an everyday policy perspective is not on the Korean side persuading them. I mean, there's some, but it's really on the Japan side because things have shifted so much, right? As you said, from your trips there in Japan. That's really the harder rock to roll up the hill right now.
Thanks. Yeah, right here.
My name is Kunio Kikuchi, and a long-term resident of Washington, and also 30 years with the World Bank. You know, actually, Korea and Japan should be, to use another Asian country, like Siamese twins. We are inseparable, and we are, let's say, our parents, cultural-wise, both our parents of both countries is China. To this day, we use Chinese script in writing, and so does Koreans, although most of the things are in Hangul, but still on official documents, Chinese is evident. And our long history, I thought today's issue should not have been just our history of since, let's say, the end of 19th century, but rather a long history of more than 1,500 years when the group of families and leadership from Korea came and dominated Japan. And to this day, the oldest city in Japan is named Nara, which I understand from my Korean friends is a Korean word. And in that background, all of you today, especially American participants, one said, what can we do? Well, you are essentially enjoying a fight between two countries who should have been friends and egging them on to continue fighting by putting all kinds of conditions instead of saying, hey, lay off. It's not that important whether Comfort Women did this or that, or whether in the government of the administration, the Japanese military or the government of Japan between 1910 and 1945 did despicable things. But mind you, there's one difference. Both of you, all of you use the word the occupation of Korea. No, there was a colonization, but the Japanese side do not regard it as occupation. They went in the wrong track of annexation. And this was approved by the League of Nations to the point, and however uncomfortable it might be, in the 1936 Olympics, it was a Korean person who won, raised the flag for Japan. So this was the history of what happened.
Well, let's see if we can get some response to that.
Yeah, and the last concluding point is our future together. It's 70 years. It's the Western powers that divided Korea into two parts. Do you think you have done enough to reunify the North and South instead of saying how dangerous North Korea is? Thank you.
I'm not sure what part of that to pick up, but if there's something, yeah, I know there's a lot of debate that we could have there, and certainly to debate 1,500 years of history would be beyond the scope of our discussion here today. But I appreciate the comments. Thank you very much. Yeah, Kevin.
I spent a lot of time.
We have a microphone for you. Identify yourself for everyone if you wouldn't mind.
Kevin Mayer with NMB Consulting, formerly with the State Department, and most of my career as a diplomat was in Japan. You know, when I go to Japan now, I think it's important to hear for the people in Korea to understand that a lot of the noise you hear in Japan about comfort women, about it not being coercive, is not from people who really represent the Japanese government, and it's not from people who represent the vast majority of people in Japan. For example, when the Osaka Mayor Hashimoto last year made these rather stupid statements about, well, it was wartime comfort women or necessary, he was roundly criticized by about 80% of the Japanese public, and it pretty much was the end of his potential as a national politician. And the Korean panelists earlier this afternoon were referring to the revisionism or the fudging of history issues by the Japanese government, but it's very difficult to find any statement from anyone in the current Japanese government that's walked away from the Kono statement or the Murayama statement. The people outside of the government have said a lot of things, but Abe and Suga have been very clear that they stick with those statements. So my question is, what do you think could be said by Prime Minister Abe now that would satisfy the Korean government? Or are we in a situation where the current political leadership in Korea it's a very complicated situation, I understand, for President Park because of her father's relationship with Japan and criticism that he was too close to Japan and didn't get a good deal in the 1965 Basic Agreement. So my real question is, do you think there's anything that Abe could say if he were to issue a new statement? There is some talk in Tokyo that he may issue his own new statement. But is there anything he could say, in your view, and what might that be, that really could, you know, move this forward from the Korean perspective?
Great. What do you think, Victor? Got some views on that?
Well, again, I mean, I've said my view on this is I don't think that these are resolvable issues. I don't think, you know, even if an agreement is reached on comfort women, even if Prime Minister meets with comfort women survivors and apologizes to them, I don't think it's going to resolve the issue because, you know, because there are clearly biases on the Korean side. They attribute any statement that's made by a Japanese politician as conciliatory as being something that's entirely motivated by the situation. It's not felt, it's just motivated by the situation. And then if they say something that's off color, that's the real Japan, right? That's sort of, so there's this bias, this attribution bias that is systematic, I think, in the Korean side that makes it very difficult for them to move on.
Let me just add, I think if you go back through the record of the last several years, you could find a number of statements made by some members of the cabinet and certainly members of the Diet that have set Korean teeth on edge and teeth in Washington on edge as well. I won't name any names or point any fingers, but I think the record shows that. I would agree with you that the vast majority of people, both in the government and outside of the government, don't subscribe to some of these more extreme views and interpretations. I think that's true, and public opinion polling in Japan confirms that. In terms of what the Prime Minister might say, one of the watchwords in dealing with these issues is that in light of the tragic and troubled history between Korea and Japan over the centuries, and I tell my Japanese friends this all the time, you can't ever stop saying you're sorry. I know that is difficult, but that's true. You just have to keep it up. America has its own issues with minorities and our troubled history as well, and you can't end the apology at one point and say, that's it, we're done, we're finished. So there has to be this ongoing subtext and context of apology that will go on for forever. But I would agree with what Victor has just said, is that the past is so problematic for many Koreans that you'll never actually end it all, but maybe the best that you'll be able to do, as troubling as this sounds, is to try to manage the problem, shelve it, As I said in my remarks, you can't erase it, you can't do away with it, you can't ignore it. You have to live with it and figure out a way to build a more constructive, positive, as President Park said the other day, and I hope she follows through on this, a more future-oriented relationship, keeping in mind the history. Half of my ancestry is Irish, and we're still fighting certain problematic issues that arose in our relations with the Brits. My grandfather was in the IRA, so there's one for you in terms of the strength of some feeling in certain parts of my family about this stuff. But somehow, the Brits and Ireland have managed to get beyond a lot of these issues that go back just as far, and in some cases further, than Korea-Japan problems. So there is a way forward.
I think there's, I don't think we're going to solve it, but I think if there can be enough progress where you can move the history issues out of the spotlight where they are now, if you can move them to the side, you sort of compartmentalize them, you don't ignore them, but not have them front and center so that they are the all-consuming viewpoint and all-consuming issue. And I think there are a couple of things. I think there has to be an acknowledgement by South Korea that the problem didn't start with Abe. I mean, anyone who's worked, these issues remembers 2002, 2005, 2009. It's cyclical, so that we need to correct a lot of the misperceptions and mischaracterizations. When South Korea, took 2 hours of a summit with NODA, and spent an hour and 45 minutes of a 2-hour summit talking about comfort women, I think that's a misprioritization of national security issues. But I think there also needs to be more fact-based than emotion-based policy in Seoul, and that requires some in Seoul to correct when people make mischaracterizations. You say, no, that's not wrong. We have our problems with Japan, but that is not correct, or that is a falsehood. And also, I think in Seoul, a need for a realization that they will never have 100% compliance. There will always be someone in Japan who says something inflammatory. And when President Park even recently said, as long as there are some politicians in Japan who say heinous things or incorrect things, we will have problems. You're never going to be able to control 100% of the population from saying something. So, and as I mentioned before, I think if you can get behind-the-scenes discussions between the two countries where Seoul identifies what it wants, what are the words, what are the examples that they want, so that Japan can see if they can provide those in return for, an agreement by Seoul to move forward if Tokyo were to utter those words.
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult. I mean, I think Bruce has done a good job. It's difficult to come up with what the exact formula would be, but conceptually, I think I know what it is. And conceptually, the issue is that both in the Korean domestic political context and the Japanese domestic political context, it is not deemed politically legitimate to reconcile relations over history right now. Right? Japanese politicians they don't feel like it wins them a great deal of legitimacy and domestic legitimacy to be forward-leaning on the historical issues. And on the Korean side, there's absolutely no incentive to be somehow conciliatory or forward-leaning on these issues towards Japan. So the point at which this thing starts to get better is when each side perceives the others as taking steps in the direction of making sort of a Japanese position on these historical issues something that is considered domestically legitimate, right? That's what happened in post-war Germany, right? In post-war Germany, in a domestic political context, the notion of contrition probably was deemed domestically legitimate, politically legitimate, something that every politician should aspire to. And that's clearly not the case in either Japan or Korea right now.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have to leave the discussion there. I want to thank my panelists, Victor and Evans and Bruce, for this discussion. It was an excellent discussion, great way to wrap things up. I hope I'm not wrong to be a little bit hopeful after this whole discussion. I thought about all the ways it could go very badly, and Sankei Shimbun almost got us there. They almost got us to the bad outcome. We didn't go there. We handled it pretty well. And I'm actually glad we heard those views in others so that we could have a conversation about them. So with that, thank you very much for coming and hope to see you next time.